Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Sandro Galea. It's my privilege to serve as chair of the study. And on behalf of the National Academies and of the committee, I'd like to welcome everybody. This task is being undertaken by this committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and includes reviewing the evidence linking social and digital media use with health outcomes in adolescents and children. The full task is posted on the study website. I want to note that it's an open on-the-record session. Interested individuals and members of the press may be attending as observers. This is not a news conference, however, and we will not be entertaining questions from the floor. Reporters who would like to talk with committee members are kindly asked to touch base with the study director, Gillian Buckley. Gillian's contact information is posted on the study website. I would like to remind everyone this is an information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions. It would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including committee members, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of national academies. In addition, committee members typically ask probing questions in this information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee then must respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the National Academies Report Review Committee and National Academies of Science President before it is considered an official National Academies report. Finally, I will remind our speakers and guests that comments pasted in the chat will be considered submissions to the committee and saved in a study file that members of the public can access. Please be mindful, if you'd like to share any pre-publication study findings or other confidential comments, that this is a public forum and the comments are also public. Having said those formalities, welcome everybody. It's great to have everybody here. And we're delighted to start today's public session with a presentation by Alvaro Bedoya, the Commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. Mr. Bedoya, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Galea. And I want to start by thanking the National Academies for this invitation, as well as the committee. And I want to thank my staff, particularly Danielle Estrada, Aaron Reiki, Bryce Tuttle, and Kate Conlow for the research and thinking that informed my remarks. So my wife and I have two toddlers, and being a parent is, of course, hard. But I think the hardest part isn't about changing diapers or losing sleep. I think the hardest part is when you know your kids are hurting, but you don't know why, and you don't know how to help them. We are in the midst of a mental health emergency for our nation's youth. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death for kids 10 to 14 years of age. And if you ask a parent today what they are most worried about for their kids, their number one answer is not drugs or alcohol or teen pregnancy. Their top concern is their children's mental health. Parents and experts are increasingly pointing to social media as a key contributor to this crisis, but they are still struggling to figure out exactly what's going on and how they can help. They're taking the kids to the doctor. They're taking their kids to therapists. They're trying to limit the hours their kids go online. They're trying to get a sense of what they do online, but the parents still feel helpless. And it's not just parents. 1 in 3 teens say that they use social media or video sites, quote, almost constantly. About the same number say that that's too much. Yet more than half say that they would not know how to stop. In response to a recent survey, a 14-year-old named Hannah said, quote, I always want it near me. Of course, she's referring to her smartphone. When I'm sitting on the sofa, I just scroll. Laura, age 13, said, quote, I kind of wanted to have more time to do stuff other than just go on my phone, but it didn't work. I kept turning it off and then going back and still using it. Otto, age 15, quote, sometimes I'll go on it at like 11 p.m. and won't go off it until 6 in the morning. Jack, 14, once you start, you can't stop. This should not surprise anyone. After all, we live in an attention economy. In the words of one engineer, companies make their money from attention. Reducing attention will reduce revenue. If you're a designer working in an attention business, you will design for attention. In the words of another engineer, there are no safety standards. There is no ethics board in the digital space. In an attention economy, companies very literally compete for our thoughts, our time, our minds. No one should be surprised if that economy affects our mental health. And compulsive use is just part of the problem. Research suggests that mental health harms are also driven by harassment, social comparison, and lack of sleep, among other factors. And of course, those are not mutually exclusive to compulsive use. Today, in the time I have with you, I want to talk with you about why we're here and the work that the Federal Trade Commission is doing to make it better. I want to start by addressing two doubts. First, I think a lot of people still question the existence of a relationship between social media use and adolescent mental health. And second, a lot of people think that any legal action would be blocked by laws that immunize websites against claims relating to the content that they publish. They also often warn that it would be unwise, even harmful, to undercut that immunity. Now, I want to speak to those doubts. Then I want to highlight a third reason, in my view, for the current status quo, and that is a lack of in-house psychologists and other mental health experts at tech regulators. So I want to talk through these three issues. I want to tell you what we're doing to try to address them, and I want to respectfully ask for the committee members' help. So I spent about the last 15 years in the world of technology, policy, and research, first in government and then in the academy and at an NGO. And when I talk about the relationship between social media and teen mental health with friends and former colleagues, one of the first questions I get is it real? Or is it just another moral panic? Don't we need more time to tell? And don't we need more research? Is it real? My answer to that question is yes, it is real. Because we have had time to observe the effects of social media. There is now a generation of students sitting in college lecture halls that have never known a world without social media and who never spent a day in high school or middle school without it. To put this in perspective, social media is older than the iPhone, older than Uber and Lyft, older than streaming services like Netflix and Hulu. It is even older than Amazon Prime. That time has allowed for research. By my reckoning, there's roughly 8 or 9 years of peer-reviewed scientific research on the impact of smartphone-enabled social media on the adolescent brain. That body of literature is nuanced. For example, the relationship between mood disorders and social media use may run in both directions. And the results of that research vary depending on what exactly is being measured, the exact population being evaluated, and the time period in question. Unfortunately, what I've seen is that some research lumps in social media with other forms of screen time, or fails to account for gender or granular differentiation in age, or looks at behavior from before 2010, 2011, or 2012, when contemporary patterns of social media use had yet to develop. But there are trends. For example, a series of cross-sectional and longitudinal studies suggest that teenagers, particularly teenage girls, who spend more than 2 or 3 hours a day on social media, suffer from increased rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. A separate set of studies have linked the use of photo-rich social media to increased incidence of eating disorders. Would more research help? Absolutely, it would, and we will soon get it. Congress just passed a new initiative that will provide $15 million in funding for more research in this year. But the existing research, the research we already have was enough for the U.S. Surgeon General to issue an advisory warning that while all uses of social media do not hurt everyone, some uses of social media likely do harm certain groups of young people. And the existing research was also enough for our nation's top doctor to say that, quote, personally, based on the data that I have seen, I believe that 13 is too young to be on social media. So while we may not know everything, we know a lot, and we cannot wait until we know everything before we do more to help. The second set of doubts I hear is focused on regulators' legal ability to address this problem and the wisdom of our using that authority. When people hear that I'm looking for ways to protect teen mental health on social media, they often say, wait, doesn't the law make it difficult to regulate content on social media platforms? And is it a good idea for a regulator to get into content moderation? They warn, based on past repeated experience, that any effort to regulate what is understood to be harmful content will inevitably result in taking down content that is offensive to some but vital to others, like resources for gay, queer, or trans youth, posts about racial justice, or information on reproductive rights. I take these concerns seriously. I'm listening to them. And I'm particularly sympathetic to concerns that efforts to protect teen mental health may end up hurting people for whom the internet is not just a convenience, but a lifeline. For a lot of trans teens, for example, social media is the one place where they can find a community that accepts them and celebrates them. Yet already today, trans people are disproportionately likely to have their posts taken down and mislabeled as adult content, even when they are clearly following community guidelines. We have to reckon with these concerns. There's no running away from them. Any effort to improve teen mental health online cannot cut off that lifeline. In my time with you today, however, I want to highlight that even if you agree with these concerns regarding content moderation, existing law still offers us a range of options to protect teen mental health on social media. Because if you take a slow, careful look at what critics say is driving teen mental health issues online, only part of it stems from content moderation recommendation algorithms. I recommend reading an extraordinary report from the Five Rights Foundation in the United Kingdom. It's called the Pathways Report. The authors of that report conducted a survey of the design strategies that, in their view, drive a range of social media harms, mental health harms. They interviewed not just product designers who built these systems, but also the teens themselves who use them. And these were the sources of the quotes I shared in the beginning of my remarks. The Pathways report argues that content recommendation algorithms deliberately play into the psychological vulnerabilities of young people to keep them online. But the report lays out a range of other design decisions separate from content recommendation algorithms that social media companies use to prolong engagement, a critical contributor, they say, to mental health harms online. These strategies include intermittent variable rewards, video autoplay, 24-hour push notifications and nudges, infinite scroll, content that expires within a predetermined window, and quantified public popularity that allows for nearly constant social comparison. These so-called persuasive design strategies are set alongside yet another set of simple privacy decisions that help drive and keep young people online. For example, a site may decide to restrict direct contact between strangers, or they may decide to allow it, a decision that undoubtedly would increase the number of messages and nudges that kids receive from an app or a service. Why am I talking about this? Because persuasive design strategies, default and open direct conversations, communications between children and adults. That is not content. That is design. That is architecture. This is the structure that social media companies have built around content. And these are the kind of features that several courts have declined to immunize. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that content recommendation algorithms are not contributing to mental health problems, nor am I trying to deprioritize the question, nor am I saying that federal law would immunize these algorithms. In fact, critics would say that these algorithms are also architecture rather than content. I'm not expressing an opinion either way on any of these questions. I am saying that there is clear room in the law today to act on closely related but separate problems. And that's exactly what the FTC just did. In December, we settled an action against the makers of the video game Fortnite, not just around issues of data collection, but also because we allege that by default, they let unknown adults speak to kids playing online via a live audio connection. This is what one parent wrote on the FTC's webpage, and you can look at it right now if you do a quick Google search. My 13-year-old son plays Fortnite, and he has been having people sending him awful messages on the game, telling him to kill himself and to die. Here's another excerpt that was in the commission's complaint, where another parent emailed the makers of Fortnite to say, quote, "This morning while on Fortnite, my 9-year-old son had someone he doesn't know in real life, but has been playing with him for months, tell him that he was going to kill himself tonight. It shook him to the core." So the commission is already using its legal authority, its unfairness authority, to stop what appears to be one of the drivers of mental health issues online. So to review, this is real, and we do have the law. We need to act. The next question, and in my view, the critical question is, do we have the expertise we need to do that? This is a question the FTC thinks a lot about. When we were created in 1914, Congress deliberately created in us an agency that would closely study complex issues, develop expertise on them, and use that knowledge to inform Congress and its own enforcement decisions. Now, over the years, the commission has looked at that expertise and strategically expanded it. In 1954, for example, the commission expanded its division of economics into a full bureau. We now employ over 80 full-time PhD economists whose research is frequently cited in enforcement briefs, court decisions, presidential reports, and academic scholarship. In 2011, the commission appointed its first chief technologist. A dozen years later, we now boast a full team of technologists who work alongside our investigators, paralegals, attorneys, and economists. They help us detect and understand complex and hard to find technological harms. And I'll just give you one example from outside of the confidential investigatory context. As a public example. In 2014, FTC technologists analyzed 12 popular consumer apps and figured out that they were sharing people's health information with 78 different third parties, including data on consumers' diets and medical systems. This is the kind of thing that would be invisible to anyone other than a technologist. And so thanks to this strategic recruiting, today, if I have a question about financials or a technical question, there are dozens of experts I can turn to in-house for help. We now need that expertise for mental health. We need in-house psychologists and other mental health experts. Let me give you a concrete example. Our most powerful consumer protection tool is arguably our authority to stop what are called unfair trade practices. These are practices that are likely to substantially injure consumers, that consumers cannot reasonably avoid, and that are not outweighed by countervailing benefits. Our policy statement on this authority from 1980 clarifies that a, quote, substantial injury can include unwarranted risks to health and safety, but that same policy statement also warns that normally those injuries will not ordinarily be, quote, subjective or, quote, emotional. In my view, this leaves clear room for arguments that mental health harms can be cognizable unfairness injuries in the eyes of the law. Why? Because there's a difference between a teenager being emotional and a teenager suffering from depression. There's a difference between a child who is nervous and a child who's suffering from anxiety. There's a difference between a kid who is down on herself and a kid who is contemplating suicide. But here is where it gets hard, because right now, if we want someone to help us understand those differences, we need to go through the process of hiring outside experts. We do not have any psychologists or other mental health experts in-house. So while we can get that expertise when we need it, those experts are not a daily part of our work, as so many other experts are. You know who does think you need full-time psychologists on staff to identify mental health harms that may arise on social media? Social media companies. I recently asked my staff to review LinkedIn to see how many psychologists were working for major tech companies. There were actually so many of them, we had to limit our search just to PhDs. In total, we found more than 200 public LinkedIn profiles for PhD psychologists and other brain scientists working for major social media companies. I also asked my staff to review public job boards. We found a number of open job listings at social media companies for senior full-time psychological specialists. One listing was for an in-house, quote, expert on psychological disorders, which could include but are not limited to substance addiction, anxiety-related disorders, eating disorders, and self-harming behaviors, close quote. The listing indicates that this person will write policies to prevent those harms and work on specific cases as they arise. Curiously, we found even more job openings for psychologists focused on making platforms even more attractive to users than we did listings for specialists to identify and prevent harms. We need to close this expert gap fast. And that is exactly what we're trying to do at the Federal Trade Commission. I'm pleased to say that under the leadership of Chair Khan, it is now part of the FTC's strategic plan, our formal strategic plan for 2022 to 2026, to explore hiring psychologists on staff. But candidly, this is one of those rare instances in which I hope someone else beats us to it. And I hope a decade from now, every major tech regulator, state and federal, across the country has at least one full-time psychologist or mental health expert on their full-time staff. So these are some of the things that I'm doing at the FTC to understand and address the impact of social media on teen mental health. My team and I are reviewing the scientific literature, assessing our authority in this space, and exploring how to bring on psychologists as the newest generation of in-house experts. In the months ahead, I'll be trying to coordinate our work across the federal government. The President of the United States has made this a top priority. The Department of Health and Human Services has recently launched a new center on excellence in social media and mental wellness. And there's real expertise on this issue, not just at HHS or the Surgeon General's office, but also at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the NTIA, and elsewhere. I'm also going to engage with my counterparts at state legislatures and critically, our international counterparts, as well as state law enforcers. We may not have in-house psychologists, but some of our colleagues in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands do. And we should learn from them as to how to add and integrate this expertise into our work. And that brings me to you, the members of this committee. I think you have such an important role to play here. We are long overdue for a reckoning on youth mental health online. And as I've said, I think a key barrier to that reckoning is a latent doubt as to whether the research supports a link between social media use and mental health. And while I personally have not come to a conclusion about any specific company or practices, based on my own review of the literature, I think it's clear that in general, there is a relationship between certain uses of social media and youth mental health. It's nuanced, but it's real. But while I'm a lawyer and an FTC commissioner, I'm not a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or any kind of mental health expert. I think that this group, your group, working through the national academies could have an extraordinary impact in sharing with the world its own expert conclusions as to the existence and nature of the relationship and the targeted research that you feel still needs to be done. I'm particularly interested in learning more about the specific designs and features that can lead to harm. What we have seen is that much of the research looks at social media in general and does not identify the granular features that are contributing to alleged mental health harms. And if I can leave you with one request, it's this. If you come to believe that regulators like me would benefit from having experts like you as colleagues, if you think it's necessary to confront this challenge, not just with law or economics or technology, but also psychology, please say so in your final report. Thank you for your time. And as a commissioner and as a parent, please let me thank you for your work.
Thank you, Commissioner Bedoya. The Commissioner can't stay for the Q&A, so we're going to take 5 minutes of questions right now, if that's okay, Commissioner. And we can take questions from anybody from on the panel. I'll just lead with a quick one, if you don't mind. I really appreciate your presentation. I thought it was clear and direct. Is there anything that is that the committee can look ahead to in terms of what one might expect from the sort of federal regulatory legislative landscape over the coming year that you could speak about publicly that we can keep in mind as we are reviewing the evidence and looking at the recommendations?
Sure, that's a great question, Dr. Gallia, and let me answer it to the degree I can. Of course, there's
Understood. That's why I said
that could be happening that are confidential if they were happening. There's a couple things to watch for. Of course, there's a lot of state legislation that has already passed and that is potentially en route to passage. And at the core of that legislation is this idea that the best interest of the child should be prioritized above financial decisions. And this is a quote from the Age Appropriate Design Code. And there's a number of parallel bills that are making their way through legislatures as well as a federal bill with the same standard. My understanding from conversations with the UK Information Commissioner's Office is that this has driven a range of changes to social media platforms for children in the UK, and that's something I would track very closely. We have an open rulemaking proceeding. We're an ANPR is the acronym that asks questions about this, and so it's possible that after reviewing a copious amounts of comments that were submitted, including from some of the leading experts on social media and teen mental health, the Commission decides to initiate a rulemaking that touches upon this. But I think what I want to underscore is that I see a range of authority in the hands, not just of the Commission, but state regulators and state law enforcers everywhere, because that unfairness standard that I outlined, that is mirrored in, I believe, all 50 states who have that authority to counter unfair trade practices. And in most instances, if not all of them, it's that same legal formula. And so I personally believe that there's a lot of room for arguments that that mental health harms are cognizable injuries under that law. So those would be the three things I would track in terms of policy and enforcement.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Commissioner. Let me take, we can take one or two questions from the committee. Anybody would like to ask a question to Commissioner? Miguel.
Thanks, Commissioner. So we always hear when we're in these data gathering sessions, the usual comparison is like we require, car seats for kids in the car, right? And we require banks to have oversight. So from the point of view of regulators, how much do you see this kind of comparison to be something fair in this more hard to define concept of social media, right? It's not as well defined an entity like a car, right, or such a thing. But as a regulator, how would you frame such comparison?
Sure. Look, I'll reject one easy one, but then I want to push back on part of it. So the analogy I'll reject is cigarettes, right? There's nothing good comes from smoking a cigarette. I think it's 2023. We can all acknowledge that. And there's a lot of good that comes from social media. As I said, it's a lifeline for a range of communities online. And so there is a need to not, for regulators and law enforcers to not harm that lifeline. That's really, really important. On the other hand, I don't want to move too far away from the analogies you mentioned, because I think that too often some old concepts we have about mental health, about it not being a real harm, can creep in. I think that mental health injuries are just as real as physical injuries, and that depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, thoughts of self, these things can be just as harmful as a broken arm or a leg, if not, frankly, much more frightening and much more dire for parents, because you know how to deal with a broken arm, you know how to deal with a broken leg. Medicine has dealt with those things for a very, very long time, but we're still trying to get, well, I'll leave it to you to evaluate the state of medicine and mental health, but I don't think that it's as broadly understood that these harms are just as real as the physical injuries, the ones you can see with your eyes. And so I don't want to push back on some of those other metaphors, because I think they're apt, frankly.
Thank you. Let's do two quick questions. One from
I have plenty of time, by the way. I'm not in a rush.
Well, we have a
yeah, of course. Yeah.
One.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the nice talk. My question is about the changing landscape of these social media technologies, and that sometimes is technological, purely technological. We have newer platforms coming up, and sometimes it is social in terms of how people actually use these platforms. People end up using them in ways that they were not really designed for. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you see regulation keeping pace with this rapidly changing landscape. And thank you for calling out psychologists. I also wonder your thoughts on the role that technologists can play in that, in influencing the design of these platforms, or what they should or shouldn't do about mental health.
Sure. So there's two questions there. Let me quickly take both of them. With respect to the first one, what we are trying to do is stay really close to the science. And let me say that one of the issues that we keep on hitting against is studies that just talk about social media, right? Rather than the different kinds of social media that exist. Some social media is very rich in photos and images. Others are really text-based, for example. And as I said, they'll lump this together and then sometimes lump in just screen time, right? Or other forms of screen time. And that doesn't help us as regulators understand the particular features that are driving harms. And let me just say that the umbrella review from 2022 that's often cited to say that the small effect on social media, that one review itself says that a lot of the studies that were included don't differentiate between social media or screen time. And if you look at the underlying studies, I think there are 31 studies, a lot of them draw on data from the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. And so for me, it is getting clarity from the research community as to exactly the features they are studying and being clear about that. The second point is technologists. Technologists are absolutely critical. The point I was trying to make is that we have come to that realization, right? There is now a philanthropic movement, maybe a decade old, to create this pipeline of public interest technologists, right? And so, I can name off the top of my head, 5 luminaries in technology who have been colleagues of people here at the Federal Trade Commission, right? And I can't even name a single person who is a psychologist or a mental health expert or psychological scientist who has been employed by the Federal Trade Commission in a full-time capacity. And so that I see as the gap. But of course, technologists are critical. And frankly, I think they could be critical in working with mental health experts and saying, okay, let's not just call it social media. Let's look at this particular branch or this particular kind of use. So I do think there needs to be a collaboration in this respect.
Thank you. Amanda, you get the last word.
Hi, great talk. As a developmental psychologist myself, I think a lot about context, and we have to understand children are spending, enormous amounts of time in specific contexts. So it just raised for me a question about regulations, perhaps at the school level, and what your office might think about for various contexts. There's some home difficult to regulate, but in a school system, there might be more leeway.
So look, as a parent, I think that's absolutely critical. The issue, not an issue, but we don't have much jurisdiction over our nation's schools. Now we do have jurisdiction over ed tech. We issued a policy statement on this, but a lot of that ed tech isn't really comparable to social media, although frankly, sometimes in some instances, it does use some of the same nudge techniques. And so personally, as a parent, I think that's absolutely critical. Personally, as a parent, I would love for there to be middle schools where they encourage children to delay, right? But I, as a regulator and a law enforcement official, don't have the authority to, ban a technology in schools. That would be something that state legislators, the federal government, and state and federal education departments would have the authority to do rather than someone in my role.
Thank you. Commissioner Bedoya, thank you. You're welcome to stay with us.
Thank you all so much. And please do not hesitate to reach out to me if further conversation can be useful. I would relish that opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. We're going to move on to Professor Sonia Livingston, who is a professor, Department of Media and Communication at London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Livingston.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And I was asked to speak about children's rights in the digital age. I think a number of my remarks will follow on closely from the speech we just heard. I'm very sympathetic to that agenda. And in the present context, I might say that I am a social psychologist by training, and I work in a very multidisciplinary space of media and communications and all things digital at the London School of Economics. So I'm going to share my some slides, if I may, just to keep me on track and on time, and I hope you now see those. Good. So yeah, so my remarks follow, I hope they speak closely to your agenda. They do follow the previous speech, but they also go a bit broader, because the child rights framework goes a bit broader. And what I'm seeing happening in the specific debate about adolescence and mental health and in digital contexts is an increasing turn to a child rights kind of framing, and that's what I want to focus on and just explore with you a little bit what its potential is, and what it can and cannot do. So just to give you a sense of my kind of research background, I am a researcher, as I said, a social psychologist. I work a lot with UNICEF on a project called Global Kids Online, where we seek theories, methods and evidence that we conduct on a cross-national comparative basis in order to understand both the opportunities and the risks of children and young people going online, and we look at them up to the age of 18 according to a child rights framing. So what I'm going to say has an evidence base behind it, and we have been increasingly taking that evidence base into a range of different international fora. I'm very conscious I'm speaking in an American context, but of course you're also part of such a wider frame. The work on Global Kids Online, the work with UNICEF has really tried and recognises both the global or transnational nature of the digital world, of many of the companies that we're addressing, and also some of the commonalities but the differences that apply in different kinds of countries. And I've just put up here some of our reports, one of which got taken up, the idea of 1 in 3, which I kind of use as a rallying point, really, though it's also statistically accurate, which is to say 1 in 3 people in this world is a child, and 1 in 3 internet users is a child. And so the kind of segue I want to make from research into a kind of child rights framework, which is a more normative framework, is really to say that I think that 1 in 3 are getting a raw deal at the moment in terms of internet governance frameworks, whether that is international or very often national. So I'm going to so I invite you to look at that work if it's helpful, and the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, as part of the UN, has been building on the research in developing its tools for parents, for children, for industry, and indeed for policymakers, where there is a kind of a hunger for evidence-based work. So to come to a child rights framing, this is UNICEF's colourful illustration of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I'm sure you know that the convention is one of a small number of fundamental international treaties, international authoritative legal statements on rights, applying particularly to children. Of course, there's also those on human rights, on the rights of persons with disabilities, and so forth. And the I think what's helpful in this context is that it gives us a framework to kind of bound and focus some of the dilemmas that I know we face when we're trying to debate how do we prioritize children's safety over children's freedom to access information of their choice, for example, or how do we balance children's ability to and young people's ability to make friends and discover kind of pursue niche interests online, with the fact that everything they do is datafied and their data is tracked, and that can be used to put them at risk of commercial exploitation, or indeed also risk of personal harm. Much of that datafication and the business models that kind of underpin the digital world, as was just said, are very much driven by an attention economy, which is certainly occupying the attention of our young people. So I find the rights framework helpful because it's holistic, because it, if you like, it's almost a checklist. We can imagine as we develop any particular recommendation or even come to a research conclusion, well, have we, to use the example just given, taken account of the best interests of the child, which, as you can see, is Article 3. Have we thought about the role of the family and children's development, which is Article 5? Have we given paid due attention to children's right to privacy, Article 16? You know, how do we balance that with their right to access to education, the responsibility of parents, the importance of protecting them from violence, their right to health, Article 24. So it's sort of a checklist, but it's more than a checklist, because it is a normative and holistic framework, which makes sure that we are considering children in the round when we make particular interventions on the basis of evidence in particular policy domains. So in the last couple of years, I have been privileged to work with the Five Rights Foundation, also just mentioned, and also the authors of the Age Appropriate Design Code in Britain. We work together to support the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in producing what's called General Comment 25. The committee, like all other treaty bodies at the UN level, makes regular general comments on how the conventions and the human rights instruments apply. And our work was to consider how the Convention on the Rights of the Child specifically applies in relation to the digital environment. And we went through each of the articles, all of them, not the few I just picked out, to really pursue, okay, what does the child's right to privacy mean in digital contexts? What are the new kinds or different kinds of violence that they require protection from in digital contexts? How do we think about the role of parental responsibility when perhaps parents don't have a way of getting between their child and the screen, or at least as has not yet been designed well yet? How do we think about the best interests of the child in digital contexts, and whose responsibility does that become? So the general comment was published and adopted, as you can see, in 2021, and I've just put up a snapshot. It's a 10,000 word document, as they all are, and it acts as an authoritative statement which guides the interpretation of the convention itself. The other images I've put on the screen are just to clarify that, as with anything that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child does, there is a very thorough children's consultation, and that's the Green Report, Our Rights in the Digital World, and it was conducted in many countries, especially in the Global South, where many of the issues that we are addressing are felt very urgently, with really often insufficient government support and business attention. I am conscious that I'm talking about children's rights to those of you in America. Every country in the world has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, apart from the USA, but the USA is a signatory. I am told that the USA is very firmly in support of the convention and does all kinds of work in support of the convention, but there are particular reasons around ratification to do, and you will know this better than I, and perhaps correct me, but to do with the specific role of parental responsibilities, or one might say parent rights. Still, so we have the convention, which offers a broad framework for holistically what is the right thing to do, what is the internationally established thing to do for children, and we have a new document now, which I'm very keen to invite people to delve into, which sets out for all those rights what this means in the digital environment. And we did our very best through a very considerable expert consultation as well as children's consultation to future-proof the document and make it have some of the specificity to particular affordances or particular features of platforms or particular aspects of digital design that I think are on the agenda of this committee. So from a very big international framework kind of back to the individual child, I wanted to echo some of the concerns we just heard, which also resonated with research I've just been doing, in fact, with adolescents, young people who have self-declared or diagnosed mental health problems. And just get a bit more into some of those design features, and I'll just offer some of the quotes. So I just put them all up so that you can, I know you're smart people who can read fast. I've just picked 3 quotes which I think help us get a bit more into detail on the kind of the close ways in which digital design plays on and plays into, often adversely, the ways of thinking and the kind of emotional difficulties of young people with mental health problems. And I've picked rather different quotes, but the first one I think has been talked about a lot recently. It is this idea that if you begin watching something, if you begin looking for something that fits your mood of depression, you will be fed more and more and more of it. And that interplay between a young person with mental health difficulties, depression, and the algorithm, which is perhaps merely designed to maximize attention, but has the effect of feeding sad video after sad video after sad video, as this young woman says. It is another kind of design problem, and I completely take Commissioner Bedoya's point that we need to get into the kind of nuance of these different design decisions. So one is the algorithm that feeds you more of what you've first looked at, even though it's bad for you or damaging. Another is the design of the random app, the app that just puts random people together. And here's a young boy talking about Omegle as just pairing him up with weird and all kinds of people, strangers. It might be fine, it might be not fine. He might have people point guns at him through the camera. It's a different kind of a design problem, a different kind of business proposition, but it's also very problematic. And for an excessive gamer, it's scary. And then the third example I give, which is more about content, but also about the spaces in which certain kinds of extreme content can be shared. I mean, here they talk about naked pictures of people, including children, which, as we know, is fully illegal. It's being discussed in relation to an everyday app, Snapchat. There are kind of multiple things embedded there. There's the sense of a young person with anxiety and suicidal tendencies who goes onto or finds themselves in an extreme space. There's what the other users are doing. There's what the platform permits the other users to do. And then there's the fact that there is no response when there is a protest. So I could give more examples, and there are different kinds of ways in which actually what the Five Rights Foundation has called risky by design, far from safety by design or privacy by design. This is ways in which our platforms have become risky by design. So let's go back to the general comment, and I just want to pull out in my remaining few minutes just a couple of ways in which I think the framing from child rights offers some helpful ways to think about how to proceed, because it's very tempting to say let's just ban the platforms or let's ban the children using the platforms. As we know, we need this holistic approach. We need to recognize that some are more vulnerable or vulnerable in different ways and others are not. Others are resilient, that these are spaces that enable expression and information, and often very much valued ways of meeting other people who can support you or offer help. So the best interests of the child, which has been much discussed in these days of age-appropriate design codes, comes from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I've just presented the phrase in which we have translated it in relation to the digital environment to say, it's almost a plea, it is a dynamic concept. It requires an assessment appropriate to the context. Since we know that the digital environment was not originally designed for children, we need to find a way of putting the best interests of every child and children collectively as a primary consideration in this very variable and very nuanced and very fast changing set of contexts. So it is a challenge. It's not to be reduced to anything simplistic. It cannot become a tick box exercise within a child rights framework. And in fact, there is another general comment 14, which specifies how exactly, what would be, if you like, a child rights respecting way of assessing the best interests of the child. And how would one do that? It includes consulting the child, consulting children, appraising the latest evidence that matters, weighing up the different interests, but absolutely not putting commercial interests ahead of the best interests of the child without a very good, lawful and transparent reason for doing so. And I hope it is not naughty to point to the way in which I am fascinated by the way in which the child rights language is finding its way into the operation of the industry, but in particular ways. So I think Meta is proud of its new best interests of the child framework, and I believe it has developed this partly in response to General Comment 25, but also the UK's age-appropriate design code. And they cite the convention, which is new for Meta, but in fact what they offer is better parental controls and a few safety features, which some of us might think they could have done many years before, but at least now they have done, and they promote. What it isn't is a best interests of the child framework according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which requires an honest accounting of the ways in which the best interests have and haven't been put primary, and some of the ways, of course, in which platforms don't put the child's best interests as primary concern their uses of data, their business model, their advertising strategies, and their provision of remedy. One other point I thought I would draw your attention to in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and General Comment 25, specifically on the digital environment. And it's something that it took me a little while to grasp when Commissioner Bedoya was talking about being a legal expert interested in psychology. I'm a psychologist increasingly interested in the law, and it's taken me a little while to work out how important is the range of measures that states have. As someone who tries to produce the evidence to inform those measures, that evidence can be used by a very wide range of measures. And a child rights framework really emphasises the breadth and the nuance and the care with which the right measures can be identified for the best purposes. But when I am sometimes asked, if you could do one thing, what would that one thing be? I'll point to what we put here in paragraph 25, which is the use of child rights impact assessments. And of course, there are many things. We do need to update legislation. We do need greater international cooperation because many of the wrongs that are done to children are transnational in nature. We do need to put budget up and give primacy to the administrative and legal processes that can protect children's rights in digital context. But a child rights impact assessment, I just wanted to draw to your attention, partly because I wrote a report about it, I became very committed, but partly because I believe that governments and businesses are used to the idea of impact assessment. They understand that you would do an impact assessment at crucial points. An impact assessment, if you like, a human rights impact assessment becomes one form of that. A child rights impact assessment becomes another form. And there is a logic which those in governments and certain parts of industry understand, but not yet, I believe, in the tech industry, and not yet as applied to children. Though in the last year, several tech companies have approached me and my colleagues and said, okay, we're going to do a child rights impact assessment. Will you advise us on this? So what am I saying? I'm saying that every time there's going to be a new proposal or a new policy, there would be a stop and think moment in which the government, the organization, the business would stop and think and say, what does this mean for child rights? Have I taken a holistic approach? Have I done an initial check just to see what rights might be affected? Point 3, have I identified the information I'm going to need? Point 4, have I consulted with children and young people? Point 5, am I taking a kind of holistic approach to think about both the beneficial and the harmful effects so that we don't make children have too many opportunities at the cost of their safety or too few opportunities because of their safety? Have I taken steps to mitigate potentially negative impacts in advance rather than waiting until children are harmed or something goes wrong? Am I transparent about how I'm going to evaluate how I do this? And do I publish the process and make it transparent so that others can see what is done? And if we just mandated that, if we just passed one law to say, if you're going to do something that might affect children in a digital context, make sure you do a child rights impact assessment. I think many things would not go as wrong as they have been at the moment. There are many other things a child rights framework would offer, but I thought, given the time allowed, that's where I would place my focus. And I thank you very much for your attention and wish you all the best in your work.
Thank you, Dr. Livingston. That was terrific. And we'll save questions for the end, just to bring us back on time. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katina Michael, who is a professor at both Arizona State University and University of Wollongong in Australia. Now, I don't know where you are, and I fear that you are at some horrible time zone change. And if that's the case, we apologize, and we're grateful to you for joining us, Professor Michael.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it was great to hear Sonia deliver that talk. I'm just having a problem here bringing up my slides. If you bear with me just for one moment, I'll try and find that window. Very strange. There we go. So friends, I'm in Australia. And I work full-time as a tenured professor at Arizona State University. I'm an honorary professor at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Today, I'm actually representing IEEE. That's a disclosure I have as a senior member of the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And I'll be focused on the title that was suggested to me, Age-Appropriate Design Code, although more specifically, I'll be talking about the Digital Services Framework for Children that we created over a period of 2.5 years, starting in 2019. The standard was approved and is now on the market in a global capacity as the IEEE 2089 standard. So what is a standard? It's a level of quality or attainment. Why do we need standards? We use them to measure, to create norms or models for comparative evaluations. We have different types of standards, international standards, regional and national, and this one in particular is an international standard. Just like, for example, the International Organization for Standardization, or the ISO standards people would be familiar with. IEEE is a standard setting organization. It's a sub-branch of IEEE, and the association brings together global, harmonized and marketable standards that are applicable anywhere in the world. So in today's presentation, I introduced to you the IEEE standard for an age-appropriate digital services framework. It's based on the 5 rights framework and principles for children. You can view this standard online for free. if you register through the portal. It's really about reinforcing principles to allow children to flourish, to reach their full potential online, and not really making them safe from the online world, but including them in the online world respectfully. So I want to position this presentation in context of the broader discussion about stakeholder responsibilities in the design and development of new digital products and service offerings for children and youth. Our applications should be for youth and children, not really against them. It should be to help them flourish. It should not be to diminish them. And as Sonia so eloquently stated, we should abide by principles as defined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as anyone under the age of 18, although that age is quite contentious depending on which market you're in. I'm not going to go through territory you've already seen probably 20 times at least in the last 2 days, but just to say that number 2 statement, motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. It's not just human rights, it's child rights. And if we look more clearly at the Article 13 about the rights of freedom of expression for the child, this is what you see. But if you break it down even further, you can see the best interests of a child in the UNCRC, but also respect for children's views, protection of privacy, access to information, the importance of rest, play, culture. Rest is very interesting here, especially when we're talking about social media addiction, as has been stipulated by the committee. The child has the right to relax, play, and to join in a wide range of leisure activities. And of course, those activities incorporate the digital world, but to rest, play in a carefree way, not in an addictive, harmful way. Protection from harmful work. A lot of our young people now are online following their dreams of earning a lot of money, as some of the famous YouTubers have. They have reputation management teams around them. It looks like they are online all the time, commenting into thousands of comments of posts. In fact, these are adults commenting on behalf of children, doing things like endorsement advertising and much more. But we are supposed to be protecting the child from exploitation. So a deep dive into the UNCRC, as Sonia noted, is really important. But rest, play, culture, and the arts, protection from exploitation, protection from harmful work. So quite controversial. In some markets, we understand that children online are those under the age of 13, quite contradictory when you look at immigration law in the same markets that stipulate anyone under the age of 21 is actually a child. And I know that personally from experiences with visa and my children. So on the one hand, it's appropriate for children to be using various forms of social media under the age of 13. And in the same market, they say that a child is under 21. And then of course we have a human being below the age of 18 years, which I try to stipulate to with regards to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. More specifically now, when we look at the comparative nature of perhaps systems thinking / design thinking / human-centered design, what is really meant by digital design with children in mind? It's certainly not excluding them from the design process, but including them in the design process, going from the various stages. Typically in the design thinking world, we talk about understanding user needs, establishing the problem definition, right through to ideation, prototyping and testing, prior to implementation and operation. I would argue human-centered approaches require a chosen design methodology to be employed, such as participatory design or co-design has been stipulated throughout this series so far. It's not enough to put on the mind of a child as an adult engineer. We must invite the child into these processes. And I would argue very, very few companies actually have done that. Invite the child to be fully immersed, fully engaged in the design process, receive feedback, and act accordingly. Participation in this instance takes the form of direct stakeholder engagement and consultation from the outset of the design process, allowing particular decisions to be influenced, if not driven by children and associated stakeholders like parents and so much more. Of course, we can get into what is true representation, but that's another seminar delivery. So co-design element stress made for versus made with or by, and here we are hoping for a child to help us in making with typically organizations that have invested time in different products. Of course, Meta's Facebook was never created with children in mind. It was a college level initiative, and now it is embraced within an economic setting. Same with some of Apple's games and much more, which we'll learn about in a moment. So in other words, we're not making anything for anyone, especially a child. We should be engaged in the design process with a child or allowing a child to co-lead. If we allow children to be engaged in the design process, then there's a lower likelihood for systems to be designed in a way that's not suitable for kids, albeit even exploitative of kids. But co-designing with children is not straightforward. Special permissions are needed and need to be established, and industry for the greater part is at a loss on how to do this and how to garner the right consent and acknowledgement for the contribution of children in the design of digital products and services. Again, going back to Sonia's approaches by companies to help them do child impact assessments. Well, what about design? Is that going to be possible in the future? Here we begin to speak about responsible approaches to design. The mass digital service offerings we have today were never created, as I said, with children in mind. It's more than a social media platform now, it's a macroeconomic system. It's morphed into a communications platform and so much more. It's become ingrained in community organizations, sports on the weekends, recreation activities, buying and selling, gaming, and much more. You can't get away from it. It's part of the social fabric of society and has gone far beyond its initial scope. So when we're starting to talk about addiction by design, rather than children's design, we're starting to see how there are so many vectors of attack on individuals under the age of 18. And to be truly human-centric means we have to be transdisciplinary. It's not enough for engineers to be calling the shots here. To do technological design and creation, we need sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists to be engaged and embedded in the design process. They will tell us more about children's values, and children will tell us more about their values. And different markets have different value systems, and even different communities within different markets have different value systems. So when we're designing for or with kids, we must be inclusive and integrate technical and non-technical expertise to consider, as I said, the underlying values. The intentional decisions means that we must embody a responsible approach to technological design. Now, there are all of these calls for this kind of thing dating back almost 5 to 6 years in particular, where we've begun to raise awareness about the exploitative actions in social media. Different kinds of social media platforms have different types of addictive qualities. We have talked about studies where we're talking about smartphone addiction. We have social media addiction defined in the literature. We even have specific social media platform addiction scales, like a Facebook addiction scale. And these are all different. They pull different strings in us physically, mentally, psychologically, and otherwise. And again, I stress these were never made for children. These were made for adults. We can look at fines delivered to organizations, which is where we can begin to look at some of the bigger, deeper issues. TikTok sued for billions over the misuse of children's data. Instagram fined millions for children's data privacy. Companies monetizing, such as Facebook, young people's personal data sold to third parties, and again, fines for violating children's privacy on YouTube in one particular platform. And this is not to call out any one particular company. Almost all social media companies have been at risk of these kinds of headlines. So in recent times, we've witnessed these penalties. Companies react. It does hit their back pocket. The violations and penalties are not grand enough. It's business as usual after some corrective behavior has occurred. But one size does not fit all. And we shouldn't really be monetizing children's data at all, if not anyone's data. And what we have at the moment is hard law in some instances, but for the greater part, soft law that is not really denting the violations or the repeat violations. So it's catch me if you can. I'll keep repeating the offense until somebody calls me out. But now we have deeper ingrained issues, such as monetary financial impacts on families, young people self-diagnosing about their mental health fears online using applications like TikTok, doom scrolling, young people just endlessly auto scrolling until corrective behavior is placed in the actual platform. And of course, lots of locational issues and age level issues. So autoplays, self-diagnosis advertisements on platforms, and you have to wonder what all of this is really about, apart from money. Interestingly, some of mental health conditions are now being directly linked back to social media platforms, such as this potential for tic development in teen girls, particularly verbal output occurring post a binge on the platform. No other explanation for it apart from we may be seeing the first instances of new diagnosis of mental health conditions. Companies now linked to deaths. This is from a very sober newspaper here in Australia, the Australian Financial Review. Teen scroll addictions. We've all witnessed this, if not in children, in ourselves. Lawsuits now coming to the fore about addiction. Very hard to prove causality, of course, but there's potential. And it seems like what we are doing is gamifying everything that we can gamify. So instead of gaming, we are being gamed, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something that we have to define in the literature. Some work has been done on this, perhaps particularly in behavioral engineering, where we start to look at addiction by design, but also the science behind repeat visits, stickiness drivers, dopamine hits, fixes that people receive, and what actually lures them back to our platform, and what kind of behaviors we can tap into to ensure more viewing of advertisements and more actions. So how do we motivate and engage the end user? How do we enact these stickiness drivers, which we used to do in traditional customer relationship management platforms, to ensure that people come back to our website within seconds? They're captured, their attention is captured, and they come back. How do we express these in equations? How do we identify that this is going on in particular platforms, and where are the ethics of the engineers actually building these applications to commit to these stickiness drivers and perhaps take advantage particularly of young people? This encourages participation in interaction through leaderboards, badges, competitions, prizes, earning points. So we meet the customer psychological needs, and then we also game the end user. And there are two approaches to this: the classical conditioning approach versus the operant conditioning. We have recently completed a paper with Dr. Robert Abbas, Christine Paraxlis, MG Michael, Jeremy Pitt, and myself, where we start to look at the differences here of what this means. How would an operant conditioning occur, and how does that happen, for example, during impulse buying online, of which now we are seeing many more children exposed to impulse buying, in-game purchasing, and much more beyond the social media addiction of scrolling endlessly and liking endlessly, just as a reaction that occurs when we observe young people at play. In the consciousness of time, I'm happy to come back to what Dr. Christine Paraxlis has called the neurobiology of addiction, but it is very interesting when you study how addiction by design actually does happen. So the code is important because most of the time these kinds of conditions or conditioning are not only unethical, but in some cases immoral, depending on the content that is being engaged with, and the rights of the child are routinely ignored on the digital world. She'll be right. This is normal, and normalized behavior continues, but there is nothing normal about impacting children, ladies and gentlemen, and we are all seeing the outcomes of this through diverse mental health aspects. Children being more anxious, children sleeping less, sleep hygiene being an issue, children being perpetually linked to different kinds of modalities online without being able to say, I need to stop. So the answer, according to Elizabeth Denham, who really brought out the flag here for the age-appropriate design code, was to actually protect children online, but go beyond that. The code is a practical guidance on how to design data protection safeguards into online services to ensure they are appropriate for use by and with the development needs of children. Now, I must state, what I'm talking about today is not the design code, but it is actually linked to the design code. It is, sorry, friends. I always like to play this song, but we're not going to have time. It's give the young a chance. But going back to the public interest and children's public interest, what does it mean? It means to incorporate a responsible innovation framework in any organization and to prove that you are doing this, to show this through your practice as any organization that is linked to the development or design or delivery of online applications targeted at children. So the public interest is central philosophy is designing digital services with children. PID is also the outcome. It's the form of a robust digital product or service that can benefit children. And here we stipulate the 5 rights principles, recognizing child users and meeting their needs and diversity, upholding children's rights, children-centered approach to data use, moderation and redress, and presenting published terms in age-appropriate formats so children can actually understand them. Now, this is the process that we embed in the standard 2089, which I'm talking to you about today. There's a preparatory phase. There's a look whether this latest innovation would in fact embrace these 5 design principles. Then we implement these. We consider a risk-based, age-appropriate design and development approach, which I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And then we deploy and upgrade as required and monitor and decommission as required. In more detail, here are the 5 rights. I won't stipulate those any further than mentioning them, but I can share these slides with you, and so you can take a deeper dive. We define all of these things, of course, in the standard. What is age appropriate? What is an age appropriate register? And here I'll just hover for a moment. It's an information repository created for clarity, unambiguity, and reasons of traceability for your product or service that contains data and insights gained in child impact exploration, prioritization, and product service requirements. I build an age-appropriate register when I conceive and ideate and create new potential services to innovate, right? So if I create something, I've got to understand what the risks are associated with that idea, with that innovation. And as I go through the design process and gain more clarity in specification, I'm able to trace the design decisions. I'm able to pause and reflect on why those decisions were made and how they are at the best interest of the child. And if they are not, to actually treat these and either let go of this idea or further implement it with some mitigation or precautionary principles embedded in the process. We talk about child-centered design, child rights. We talk about life cycle models and risk treatments. And the risk treatment is the process, procedures, methodologies, and means that provide a basis for and facilitate the reduction or elimination of what's known as an intolerable risk. An intolerable risk is one that I can't stomach. It's one that I can't actually approve of because I know it will cause harm. And these are the addictive things. Not only should I not be engaging in addictive by design engineering, I should be really mitigating all the risks that are known to me, and also through observation of trials on children and so forth. We should be doing everything we can to support children. So who should be really concerned about this? And what can we do about it? Well, we can provide services and products that engage children. We can build a new generic or application-specific product, service, or system from scratch for children, with children, implementing a major revision to an existing product. And this is going to be the biggest hurdle. It's not like we are starting from scratch. It's not like we are saying companies are not trying, but we are looking at existing product services and we are trying to understand how to improve them to allow a child to flourish, not to exploit a child. And I would go one further. If we are doing this for children, we should be doing this for everybody. Adults shouldn't be exploited either. We are planning the acquisition of a tailored product. We should be considering this or doing research in organizations, including universities, that build a new product, service, or system. This is what the sort of risk reward chart on the right here looks like. If I find that there is a risk, I treat that risk. If I can't tolerate it, I toss that idea out the window. I do not engage that in the design process. It is excluded until I find a mechanism by which I can accept and own the risk so that there is a reward eventually on the individual. Second last slide here, I believe. We are doing this through the standard to assess risks and rewards arising from the identified hazards and opportunities. We decide how to address each risk or potential reward benefit of the product or service that you're able to by prioritizing which risks or potential benefits need addressing soonest and recording these decisions. You need to record these in the age-appropriate register. You need a traceability. You know, if the Food and Drug Administration requires that we keep these large technical and historical files with regards to the creation and development of a drug, for example, why aren't we doing this for social media platforms or the design process? We should be held accountable here. We should say we have investigated this. We have evidence to show, to prove that what we are bringing to market will not cause health harms or otherwise. We implement mechanisms to keep children out of the parts of products that are not appropriate for them. Okay, offer it to adults if required, but not to children. Verify that the measures you have implemented to address risk rewards are acceptable to stakeholders, including children, and record the outcome in the register. So we need project teams that incorporate top management champions, systems experts, age-appropriate leads, child rights advocates, senior product managers, moderators, transparency managers. For the greater part, project teams are not made up of these different types of skill sets. Generally, they are made up of engineers, maybe 1 or 2 people at most, who create these products and particularly hone in on algorithms that are creating different types of biases depending on age, and age can be detected in many different ways through biometrics, even the kinds of words being engaged with, and the kinds of sentence structures and the kinds of elaboration through this kind of typing online. Stakeholders that we need to consult, not just engage, include parents, school teachers, counselors, medical professionals, e-safety commissioners, and many others. And this, friends, is all about stakeholder empowerment, which we are continually talking about in design processes, particularly co-design. So the framework centers around the following key areas. We recognize that the user is a child. We consider the capacity and upholding the rights of children. We offer terms appropriate to children, and we present information in age-appropriate ways, and we offer a level of validation for the service design decisions we've made, and the standard provides a specific impact rating and evaluation criteria and sets out how vendors, public institutions, and the educational sector can meet the criteria. We are not for one moment saying organizations are falling short. We are saying we have reached a new age of maturity on the online world, and we can work in conjunction with the frameworks already embedded in industry by adding this standard to the suite of processes that are embraced in organizations. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Michael. That was terrific. We'll save questions for the end. We'll move on to Professor Catherine Montgomery, who is Research Director at Center for Digital Democracy and Professor Emerita at American University. Professor Montgomery.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
thank you for
sorry.
joining us.
Well, I'm just really delighted to be here, and I thank the committee for doing such wonderful work. I'm really very pleased to see these issues come to the fore and to see an activist Federal Trade Commission and all the great work that that agency is doing and all the other wonderful work that's going on. I have some slides I want to share with you. Let me just set those up. And okay. So I have a long career as an academic. I'm retired from American University, and I've taught for about 25 years. But I also have a parallel and sometimes intersecting career as an advocate, as a policy advocate in Washington, D.C. And that's really the work I want to talk about today. You've already seen a couple of these headlines in the previous presentations. I want to just point out that one of the key regulatory tools behind all of these decisions, not necessarily the only one, but an important one, is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which was enacted in 1998 in the United States. And it was my organization, the Center for Media Education, that led the campaign, the effort that ultimately led to passage of that law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that history today, because I think it's important for us to understand that historical context and the important lessons that those experiences hold for us today as we continue our efforts to ensure that children are well served by the digital media system and that they're protected as well. I closed the Center for Media Education when I returned to teaching in 2003 at AU, but our work has been continued by the Center for Digital Democracy, and that's where I work as the senior strategist. So we've continued to be involved in all of this work. Just to talk a little bit about the kind of work we've been doing over the years, we really track the commercial digital marketplace and have been keeping a close eye on how it has evolved to really understand its strategies, the technologies, the kinds of practices and operations. And in many ways, we have served as an early warning system about what we need to do about this evolving technological system in this industry. We've also worked with a variety of coalitions across a number of issue areas and have worked on a variety of topics, which include children and youth, but also embody many other areas that would fall under just general public interest in the new technologies area, and have engaged in policy intervention. So what I want to talk about today, I want to talk a little bit about the historical context and the strategy and some of the impact of the campaign to pass COPPA. And then I want to also talk about what has been covered in several of the other presentations, but to try to help us think holistically about the major features of today's contemporary commercial digital media system. And that's really such an important part of it and what its implications are. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the current policy openings for privacy and marketing regulations, as well as some of the other kinds of regulation that are being considered now, and what I see as implications and recommendations for the future. So I'm going to take us back for a moment about 30 years to the early days of the internet as a mass medium, which many of you may remember and some of you may not. But I think what's important about that time is that this is a technology that held incredible promise. And I think a lot of that promise has been fulfilled, but we've seen it also go in other directions. We referred to it, it was publicly referred to as the information superhighway back when I was working on these issues initially, which really reflected a view and an assumption somehow that this would be a public resource, a public medium. That quickly changed. It was privatized and it was also commercialized very early on, really. I was involved, and our organization was involved in the United States with a number of other public interest organizations to create a coalition across issues with consumer groups and education groups and civil rights groups, civil liberties groups, et cetera, to call for what we called public interest principles for the information superhighway, because we felt it was really important that there be public policies to include and ensure that all people would be well served by this new medium, that was not necessarily going to happen automatically, that public policy had to play a role there. So we identified critical areas. We tried to make that public so that people could think about the role that government should play. There were early deliberations internationally, really, about privacy in the new online environment. And the role of the European Union was really important here in enacting its 1995 data directive, which put some pressure on US industry and the emerging technology industry. And the Federal Trade Commission took control over that issue and held a number of public workshops and hearings among a lot of us during that time. We were among the group calling for comprehensive privacy legislation at the outset because we knew data was at the heart of this new system and we knew that there needed to be protections. However, the official policy of the US White House was really hands off the internet, and there were public documents that made that very clear. That was also the industry's position. This was also a time when, during the early commercialization of the internet, when children had already become an important market, were early adopters of these technologies, and they were key targets. And there was enormous amount, and you talked about psychologists, several of you earlier, there were psychologists back in the 1990s already focused on how children were engaging with digital media. And I went to an industry conference once in New York, and I remember hearing someone say that when children went online, they automatically went into the flow state, and that was a perfect environment for advertising. So it was clear to us that they were going to be targets of very aggressive advertising from the outset. And the model for all of this was what was called one-to-one marketing, which is developing one-to-one relationships with consumers. And in the case of kids, this meant that the vision was to have product spokes characters like Ronald McDonald engage in ongoing communication with children. So we realized that it would be really important to try to engage in some kind of intervention during this early period to get some markers in place, to get some laws and regulations on the books that made children. We didn't have the idea, by the way, of design. I wish I had thought about that. I really was thinking about the idea of designing with children in mind. We wanted the industry and the government to recognize children as a particularly important resource and an age group that needed protections, and it needed to be looked at in a very, positive way in terms of their own development. So at that time, the whole issue about children and the internet was being framed almost exclusively around safety, which is an important issue, but it was almost all on cyber porn. No one was really looking at the commercial aspects of the internet and what this meant. We needed to convince the White House that they had to make an exception when it came to their hands-off approach to internet regulation, and children had to have some protections. And we were able to get some language in there based on the little bit of research that we had on advertising and television. And we really wanted to set some rules that could help guide the children's online marketplace. So what we were able to do was to document some of the harmful practices that we were already seeing in the mid-90s and to make those public, and then to file a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission based on the idea of deceptive marketing. And this is an example of one of the really early websites that was a market research site. It was touted as a website that was designed to collect a lot of information for kids for market research purposes, but it was billed to children and their families as a safe website and a playground for children. And so we worked with Georgetown University Law Center. We documented what they were actually doing there, and we filed a complaint. And that became the basis of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which ultimately had to be enacted by Congress because the FTC really didn't have the authority to regulate in that area. So it was passed in 1998. It took effect in 2000. I think many people may already be familiar with it. It applies to websites targeted at children under 13. It's enforced by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. And even though it's somewhat narrow in scope, it has curtailed many of the most egregious data collection and targeting practices that emerged online. Now, I just want to briefly kind of highlight some of the key challenges that we faced when we were working on this issue. One was, how do you set the age limit? And that really was a challenge for us. We wanted it to apply to all children under 18, but that was difficult partly because of this issue of enabling young people to participate and get the information they need. So how do you figure what age to make it? We relied on the tradition, some of the regulations already in place for television, which were around 12. And so we chose 13. That hasn't been perfect. Everybody knows what all that has meant. In a lot of ways, it has closed off participation sometimes to under 13, but that was the decision that we made, and we have continued to push for regulations that would apply to adolescents. I also want to mention that the industry argued at the time it's really too early to regulate. Let's wait and see what happens. We knew better than that because we already seen what had happened in television. Once the medium became highly commercialized, it was impossible to regulate it, at least here in the United States. We did build into the law the ability for the FTC to update it, to look and see where things were going and to issue new rules. And they did that in 2012 so that they could include geolocation and social media and a lot of other things that weren't around in 1998. And they're continuing to do that. And we're hoping to see some more update, but we need more than that, because now we have a huge burgeoning digital marketplace that is still targeting children, and though there are some safeguards in place, a lot of them have really eclipsed this tool that we have that was put in place in 1998. And I just want to spend a few minutes, and I won't spend very much time, highlighting some of the key features so that we can sort of think of them all together. One is that market research, testing, has all been woven into the digital experience for young people. It's completely woven in. Every behavior is measurable, online and off. And psychologists and experts in neuroscience have developed a field of neuromarketing, which is just, investigating how people's brains respond to advertising. It's incredibly sophisticated, and it's amazing in terms of how it's grown. It's grown even more, and it applies to all of us, but including young people. There's now this emergence of what's called ad tech, or in some cases kid tech, where there's an integration of advertising, marketing, all operating together in real time using AI and machine learning, with tracking across platforms with the capability of harvesting massive data. This visual is from Disney's ad serving software, which they call Yoda, for yield optimized delivery allocation. Just one example. We heard some references earlier to influencers. It has become a multi-million-dollar business. It does raise issues, I think, about youth labor. And there are many, many issues there. It's also unfair. It's incredibly unfair, and it's highly, highly deceptive. And the current regulatory requirements, which are almost none in the US, are very, very inadequate. In addition to that, we have a huge burgeoning streaming video industry, both television and online, much of it ad supported, which is part of an integrated surveillance marketing system capable across all of these devices of tracking and young people and collecting more and more data. We've already mentioned gaming. I won't even go further than that. I think there's lots we could say about it, but it's a key part of this huge digital marketplace. And that's also moving into the metaverse, really extending the popular gaming environments into an extended reality, virtual reality universe, which advertisers are already moving into, have already moved into, and are helping really to design it. And harnessing this technology to take advantage of young people's identity formation process. And then finally, the whole IoT marketplace with wearables, digital out of home, digital billboards are becoming even more important, with enormous abilities to track and target us. So what we have now is a global media and marketing system that is targeting young people. Where data and advertising are inextricably intertwined. And if I can get only one point across, I think I need to get across that the commercial imperatives are continuing to shape the structures, the operations, and the affordances of youth digital experience. And they're designed tap into the key developmental needs that young people have for identity exploration, interaction with their peers, personal expression, etc. And they're also designed, as people have pointed out, to foster engagement. That is a fundamental part of it. I just want to mention also that youth of color are a key target of digital marketing. We included a huge section on that in a report we issued last year that looked at the junk food industry and the global big tech and big food relationship, the relationship between those two industries and how they're targeting young people. But of course, as we know, we have now an industry that's under pressure, which I'm happy to see with the growth of tech accountability, growing concerns over adolescents. And many of us have been calling for attention to adolescents. I'm very gratified to see that we're now really thinking about teens. They've been overlooked, they've been ignored, they've been marginalized in the policy debates. And I'm really pleased that we're seeing them take center stage in terms of our concerns. The hearings in Congress have been critical in raising this issue. And of course, we've seen industry come forward with a flurry of announcements for safety policies, some ad policies, all kinds of things. We actually issued a report this year that did a little survey of all of those. And, you know, as Sonia Livingston was pointing out, you know, they are in many ways very limited. And as we found, they're designed not to interfere with the business model that's fundamentally driving this industry. There are also a new set, and I think this has really been one of the most active periods of legislative and regulatory developments around children and digital media that I've seen in my career. And right now we've seen updates of COPPA extending the age beyond 13. There's a broader Data Privacy and Protection Act that was introduced in the last session of Congress. Many of these will be reintroduced in this session. We've talked about the design code, which has been very much influenced by the UK policy and the California law that's already in place. So I think we'll hear much more discussion about design. And then, of course, the Federal Trade Commission has a current rulemaking on commercial surveillance, and it does include a strong focus on children and teens and data targeting. We're calling, and as we work with other advocacy groups for prohibitions on the collection, use, and sharing of data for personalized targeting. We want to institute data minimization in a very real way and eliminate the uses of data that are harmful to the well-being of young people, limit geolocation, ban discriminatory ad practices, and stop the use of dark patterns and other manipulative and unfair marketing techniques, and particularly the engagement techniques. These are really tied in to the design framework. So I think that there's a growing interest among advocates for children's privacy that we need to look at a broader range of issues, and that we really do need to think about designing these systems to serve the well-being of children. So finally, here's what I'd like to just offer, you know, for the future as we think about it. We're going to continue, obviously, to see technological innovations, and we'll see that there will be more commercial opportunities that are going to drive expansion and content and services in the children's digital environment. And many of these new tools do hold potential to benefit young people's lives. I want to make sure that I say that, because I feel very strongly about it. And there are lots of ways that these technologies will benefit them. Young people want to participate. They should participate. I'm particularly interested in seeing how the digital media environment can help instill the important qualities of civic participation and involvement in democracy that I think is so important. And we really need to be thinking about that for young people. But we're also going to see that there will be more concerns raised about physical health, mental health, discrimination, equity. And we must look broadly at the rights-based policy initiatives. Internationally, we need to work together to do that. And of course, we are going to continue to need interdisciplinary research on the psychosocial impacts of this evolving media and marketing system. And they need to be granular enough to really address the emerging new platforms and uses of these technologies in a way that will be meaningful to both researchers and policymakers. So that's it. Here is our website. We have lots of information if anybody is interested in any of our reports. And I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montgomery. That was terrific. We'll save questions till the end. We're going to move on to our last speaker before we get to Q&A, Gerard Kelly, who is Senior Counsel and Director of the Privacy Program at Common Sense Media. Gerard?
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen here. And thank you, Catherine, for the great presentation and segue into the metaverse here. Let me, let's see here. How does that look?
We don't see them yet.
Oh,
but I think, Catherine, your slides may still be on because I see end of, maybe you can stop sharing, Catherine, if you don't mind.
I'll stop sharing as well. Oh, yep, Catherine's still sharing.
There you go. Now you can share maybe.
I censored you. I apologize.
Not a problem. Let's try this.
Zoom subtlety is very effective.
Okay.
Gerard, you're on now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again for having me and Catherine for the great segue. I'm Gerard Kelly. I'm the Director of the Privacy Program at Common Sense Media, where we rate the privacy practices of popular apps and games like social media for kids and teens. Today, I'm going to be talking about a recent research report we just launched, talking about the privacy of virtual reality, another one of these emerging technologies where we're seeing social media move into this space, into these immersive environments used by kids and teens. And we've heard a lot from parents and educators and consumers and policymakers. What exactly do these devices do? What do they collect? So we wanted to kind of do a deep dive and help folks understand the privacy risks and harms, especially the relationship to social media and mental health. But also, I think, provide evidence, right, to inform policymakers, to inform regulators, because these technologies are growing in adoption every day. For folks who want to do a deeper dive, the report is available online at commonsense.org/privacy of virtual reality. When we started this research, there's a lot of different articles talking about the benefits of VR, of which there are many. Teens and consumers, learning about different aspects of history, for example, or games. But there's very little research on users' privacy when it comes to this emerging technology intersection with social media. At Common Sense, we read privacy policies, and we also do some of the technology analysis behind the scenes. So we wanted to really do a comprehensive look at these technologies and their intersection with kids and privacy. It's a pretty big report at 100 pages, but some key findings and takeaways are that not a single popular virtual reality headset on the market right now has earned our recommendation for kids and families. So that really means that every single device in one way or another is monetizing the data that kids are, as they're using these environments, their gestures, their movements in these 3D spaces. It's putting their privacy and safety at risk. Every device we tested through different mechanisms and different ways by getting our hands on the devices, it's using the data for profit. And the data in virtual reality is a lot different, I think, than most folks realize. It's this evolution of social media from computers and web browsers to mobile devices to tablets. It's very sensitive data. It's very intimate about our bodies, our height, our movements, what we're looking at, what we're not looking at, our pupil dilation. A lot of these things we have no control over, but in these really rich immersive environments, all of this data is being used to profile and could be used in different ways to exploit or manipulate users' perceptions of brands or companies or other products in virtual reality. There are some ways with some of these devices to help with settings and controls to turn off some of the data collection features, some of the targeted advertising. But really, most of the devices don't have any controls at all. And we'll get a little bit into those findings. I think a big takeaway is we talk with parents about virtual reality devices and as they come into the home, and now educators are asking us about, in the computer lab. So, having these devices so students can learn about these emerging technologies. It puts a huge burden on parents, educators to figure out all these settings, these updates, how to lock down these devices and protect the privacy of the users. And with every update to the device, with every update to the social media app, all these menus, all these settings change. And so it's this constant, battle that folks are trying to use these devices safely. I won't show too many tables from the larger report, but just to kind of give you a sense of the most popular devices we rated. The brands were Microsoft, HP, HTC, PlayStation, Meta, Valve, and Pimax. These are the most popular devices on the market with kids, with teens, with students in classrooms, with adults. We took a pretty good representative sample to see these different devices in different contexts. Some are for business, some education, some for kids at home. And this gives you kind of a look at just the privacy practices. So for this report, we read all the privacy policies of the most popular devices, and these can be quite lengthy. And our 150 point inspection on all the different data collection, data use, so for example, security, compliance, parental consent, all that's available in the report and online. But summarizing this and just for commercial purposes, all of these devices received our warning rating because in one way or another, whether they're using the data collected in virtual reality to target advertisements, whether they're tracking your data and movements and interactions in virtual reality on other apps and services across the internet over time, or maybe profiling you for different commercialization purposes for data brokers, all of these devices through their privacy policies at least are transparently saying, yes, we're monetizing your data. And I don't think a lot of folks realize that these are just the devices themselves. This is just the hardware. Once folks install a social media app on these devices, that's another layer of data collection, another layer of data use by third-party VR apps, which also we take a look at and report some of the most popular social media experiences in virtual reality, like VR chat, for example. We also take a look at observationally the data flows. So where is the data coming and going with the devices? And unfortunately, all of the devices are sending data to known third-party advertising trackers as well. So it's not just the companies that are potentially monetizing data, it's those third-party data brokers as well. Right now, I think, as we think about virtual reality as this emerging, technology, this emerging space, we're seeing folks like Meta put billions of dollars into this space as kind of the new evolution of social media. I think it's really important to take a step back and realize we can, take this moment to really think about safety, think about privacy from the start. Before, like mobile devices and tablets and laptops, they're so ubiquitous in our society. We have to look back and say, how has social media impacted, risks and harms to kids and teens and mental health? I think now we need to really think about the next evolution of social media and how these devices are being used. Because as I mentioned before, they're collecting exponentially more data about their users than, let's say, a social media app on a mobile phone or tablet or web browser. And the data is so much more sensitive. It's so much more intimate about our body, about our health than other forms of social media engagement. As other speakers on the call today have mentioned, we also need to think about these immersive environments in the intersections with social interactions. I think Fortnite was an example raised earlier today, because even with gaming and other social media today, many users, kids and teens, experience sexism, racism, homophobia, lots of different forms of harassment. So it's really critical as we let teens and consumers and children play in these spaces, engage in these spaces, that they're age appropriate and privacy and safety are built in. As mentioned on the call by Sonia, other folks like Meta they're redefining the best interest of the child, right? The VR manufacturers themselves are saying that they respect privacy, that they care about users' privacy, but their privacy policies and the devices themselves tell a very different story. So I think it's really important for us to define what privacy means in virtual reality before manufacturers define it for us. As I mentioned before, we really can't recommend any virtual reality headsets for use by kids and teens. All of the most popular devices we looked at, from Meta to HP to HTC to PlayStation, all of them are tracking the data. They're profiling users in the way that they move, the way that they interact with different games and apps and services through these devices. For different commercial purposes. Many privacy policies didn't say anything about virtual reality or all of this type of sensitive data. So even virtual reality manufacturers, even virtual reality app developers, their policies aren't talking about data in this new virtual reality way. We're seeing a lot of policies that are not transparent. And so I think a lot of, thought needs to be put into, if we're emerging, social media into this new immersive environment, we need to be thinking about data collection, data use, privacy, safety in these different ways, because policies are not transparent enough for parents or educators or consumers to make informed decisions. I mentioned a little bit before that because we have our hands on these headsets, we're testing them in our lab. None of these devices are using privacy by design, or as mentioned earlier on the call, the age-appropriate design code, right? So where privacy is set by default. So these devices are not, for example, assuming that every user who puts on a headset should be a child or teen, and their data should be protected by default. There's the opposite, where all these devices are assumed you're an adult, and so all of the data essentially is being monetized until you opt in to, in some cases, create a child profile or other designation that the user is a child. And many of these devices simply say no one under 13 allowed. For example, in the case of Meta, where they do have some parental controls and parental supervision options, but those don't really turn off the use of data for commercial purposes. So as I mentioned, none of these devices are really, at the level that we would expect, especially with the recent passage of different age-appropriate design codes. Those baseline protections are not there. So about more than half of the devices we tested don't have any parental controls. And so that's a problem, because we know, hearing from parents and educators and the folks that they're testing them out with their children. Their children are really, interested in these devices, and there are virtual reality apps by third-party developers that would appeal to children on these devices. And then less than a third didn't have any safety settings at all. So, for example, when users would go into these virtual immersive environments to talk to different avatars and have those social interactions, there were no settings to limit, your personal information, limit the visibility of your profile, limit who you can talk to by default. These third-party virtual reality social media apps are catching up, but right now it's still the Wild West. I mentioned a little bit before about, this report takes a look at all the different data that's collected, because it's so more sensitive than what you would typically think of as data collected through a social media app on a mobile device. I don't think folks realize how much more data, because it really, it's almost like a digital fingerprint that's being created about your interactions in this new, emerging technology. So that, your movements in VR, the headset, the different handheld that you use, the different cameras that can tell where you are in your room, all of this is tracking you more than 100 times a second. So spending more than 30 minutes or more in a VR simulation, which many kids and teens do, playing a game or app, that's over 2 million unique data points. So exponentially more than the swiping and tapping and interactions and metadata you can get with a traditional social media application, which is why I think a lot of folks like Meta and other companies are putting so much money into this emerging technology. In many cases, what happens in VR, is automatic. You don't realize that your pupil dilation, based on what you're seeing, your interactions, this is really, private information, but it's not just on a screen anymore, right? You're not just seeing a photo or seeing a video, you're experiencing it. And so I think that goes to some of the mental health risks and harms and psychological impacts. And it's just totally new environment. There's also physical risks as well. When I was testing some of these devices, I literally walked into a wall. So it's an entirely new environment that I know folks, when they're looking down at their mobile devices, they don't know where they're going, but there's physical risks, there's mental health risks, there's psychological risks. This is a really new type of environment. And I think, we really need to think about building in privacy by design from the start. A lot of researchers have looked in different academic publications that these type of interactions, these type of experiences can actually influence a user's behavior to possibly have a favorable brand association, to choose different paths or different behaviors, different choices with different avatars can encourage different riskier choices, maybe to purchase more in-app currency to get folks to come back into the environment. I know we talk about screen time with kids and teens, but this immersive virtual reality time could be prolonged if there's more notifications on the outside world telling you to come back into virtual reality to have those personalized engagements and personalized experiences. And even with research with kids, false memories that what happened in these virtual environments actually happened in real life. So I think a lot more research needs to happen in this space because of all the different experiences that go above and beyond our typical social media experiences on mobile devices today. We did look at all the privacy settings of these devices because a lot of parents and educators say, well, I already purchased a device or two, right? We're exploring these in the computer labs, in a school environment, or at home. What can I do to help protect the privacy in some meaningful ways? And so there are options to turn off, for example, targeted advertisements. There are, for example, options with Meta's new Quest 2 headset for users over 13 to turn on some parental controls where parents can supervise activity that's happening in virtual reality, limit screen time, for example, limit the type of applications that can be used on the device. But that puts a lot of burden, right, on parents to continually monitor this new complex space that parents really haven't even experienced for themselves. So it's difficult for them to understand how to, to make these devices more privacy protecting, when really, if we think about the age appropriate design code conversations, privacy by design, putting those protections in by default from the start. Just like screen time on a laptop, or screen media on TV or mobile device, screen time is definitely a part of that. Supervision for parents, educators, making sure the content that is viewing in VR is age appropriate. If there's the social media interactions that, there is that increased risk, right, for interactions with strangers or folks who are not, under 13 or adults. And when we think about teens as a separate category from kids, there are different interactions that are beneficial for teens, for example, right, to interact in new spaces and new contexts, exploring new ideas and exploring experiences with their friends. So again, it's important to think about age appropriate content. So it's important to think about child profiles. It's important to think about the applications that teens are using. I think a big takeaway is that although this is a very dense report, it talks about all the privacy practices of the devices, all the sharing of data with third-party data brokers, but the industry can change. There's a lot of talk about this year that maybe Apple or Google could relate their own virtual reality device or augmented reality devices this year. So thinking about privacy for other VR manufacturers is an opportunity. Some of the conversations we have with parents and educators are they want to purchase these devices. They're really expensive right now, but the costs are going down. Are there any safe options for children or teens? So I think this is an opportunity for other VR manufacturers, for other third-party VR app developers to create privacy protecting applications and devices and differentiate themselves. Because right now, we can't recommend any devices on the market. A couple comments on the call earlier about data minimization. Because these devices can potentially collect millions of data points about folks, a digital fingerprint, if you will, about our automatic and bodily responses, our height, our gaze, our gestures, minimizing that data, right, only for the purpose of providing the experience, not for these additional commercial purposes. There should be more settings with these devices, as I mentioned earlier. The devices that do have settings don't provide clearly, the right settings. There's not, the settings to turn off, for example, tracking across other apps and services. So what happens in VR leaves VR, and and it can follow you across the internet and over time. So all these, these settings don't really, I think, get at the core of these devices, which are to monetize the data of users in these experiences. And as mentioned earlier, for folks like myself and other researchers who are reading these privacy policies, trying to understand all the different data that's collected by virtual reality devices and by VR apps, folks need to be much more transparent in their policies, because they're not even talking about these new types of data collected in virtual reality. They're not talking about how our biometric information is derived for advertising purposes, which is potentially far more invasive than what our our current social media interactions are, because it's involving your health information as well, to target information both in virtuality and on other apps and services on other devices over time. So I'm really I'm going to end on the point here that I think now is a time where we're going to see more virtual reality devices enter the marketplace, more investment, more virtual reality apps used by kids and teens, and more adoption. But really, I think bring this issue to the forefront, because this is where social media is evolving into these new different types of technologies, making sure policymakers, making sure regulators are aware of these issues, and thinking about how we can craft sensitive common sense reforms to protect kids and teens.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared. That was terrific. And thank you to all the panelists. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Professor Amanda Geyer, professor at University of California, Davis, and the panel member who will facilitate the Q&A. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers for sharing their work and insights. I think I will just open it up first to our panel members here for questions. Questions for any of our speakers? Yeah, Sarah, please.
Hi, and thank you so much for a set of great talks, very informative. My question is mostly to Sonia, but I think a lot of the talks spoke to this as well. The framework of the child's rights is really helpful in thinking through what are the kinds of things, considerations, as you have worded, to keep in mind. But I guess related to that, when they are in conflict with each other, I'm wondering, what's the path forward? And maybe you spoke to this with engagement with the children themselves, but in a space where these things are sort of flowing, I'm trying to think through what are the mechanisms that would be in place, especially when we say something like a consideration. It seems to me like a little harder to determine whether somebody has done a good job with it compared to an outcome where you know that somebody's hurt versus not. A company might say, yes, we do consider it's part of how we think through, where we consider the privacy, we consider the right to know. So I'm curious to think through how to balance them with each other and the processes that might be involved in that. But I should also point out that some of the examples that you also provided also were, very sort of revealing to me in that, there are cases where it's actually they're not in conflict, and maybe they do raise these cases where they are in conflict, but a lot of times they are in conflict with their bottom lines. And I think that the points that you made, as well as other speakers, really spoke to that. So that was really informative. But I'm curious how you think through a mechanism that balances these things in a way as the platforms themselves are changing, as what the children might want for themselves might be changing, and in a space where companies can claim they have considered things. So
thank you so much. You raise, I think, the really critical question. And I have a number of answers, no single answer and no silver bullet. I think the idea that rights conflict is overstated generally in the kind of popular and sometimes the expert debate, because really they support each other. I mean, there is no point in children being safe if they can't participate in the world, if they're so safe, and there is no point in them participating if their safety is sacrificed. So we must find a way in which and we could put it the other way: the safer you are, the more able you feel to participate. Safety supports participation rather than simply undermining it. And one might say the same for privacy. It is when you feel you have your privacy, picking up on common sense media, that you on Gerard's point, that you are able to get some of the support you might need or join with the others in ways that are beneficial. So we need to see the rights as potentially supportive, and then we need to ask what is going wrong, that they seem to be conflicting. And I do think that comes down to probably two things. I mean, one is that the designs, the digital products have already made trade-offs that are that we never got consulted over, and now we are kind of trying to retrofit them to what we think should be the right answer. But decisions have already been made that every time you go online, your data will be collected, for example. So, you know, if we backtracked and said, how can we enable children to go places they want and express themselves in ways that are privacy respecting, we might come up with different kinds of products in the first place. So we are in the land of retrofitting, and that's challenging. I think the second answer is that we often look for a more generic solution than is going to be plausible. So it would be lovely to say, if we all did this one thing, then everything would come right, and it's just that we can't find the one thing. But in fact, the complexity of the young people, the digital products, the societies, and the pace of change mean that we are going to need agile solutions, flexible solutions, and they might be more granular. It might be granular by age, as Catherine would advocate. It might be more granular by product, and we might need to find ways of regulating differently for different kinds of products rather than digital products. And so I think, and we might need to review the balance more often. But I think so I think that's sometimes where we find solutions unsatisfactory. But the principles of a child rights approach are not to dictate solutions, but to say the solutions you come to should have consulted on the best available evidence and expertise, the views of children, which are must always be included, but don't always give us the answer. And then the kind of balance of concerns that apply in particular cases. And it's kind of our search for convenience sometimes that leads us to want a more generic solution. It would be much easier if we were tailoring different kinds of governance solutions to different circumstances. So I realize I'm not giving you a single answer, but I do think the principles of transparency, consultation, and putting children's interests first as a lens can take us a long way.
Thank you so much. Next question from Jeff.
Thank you all. As Sharon said, these were great. I have a perhaps strange question. And Sonia, thank you for laying all that out. It sits a little bit in contrast to some of the conversation yesterday where we had where transparency is this thing that's used to kind of obfuscate legally. But I think I understand what you're saying about transparency, which is, honest transparency. This would be for everybody, but I guess Catherine and Gerard in particular, I'm a psychologist, and so I would love for you to help me think through how privacy is related to well-being. Like, I get it at a high level. Like, if I feel like I have, control over information about myself, that might make me feel more secure or confident. But since we're charged with this sort of more well-being aspect, how do you think about privacy in relationship to that concept? Could you just articulate that for me a bit?
Yeah, I guess what I would say, and I try to kind of underscore this in my remarks, I see privacy in the digital space as fundamentally connected with the commercial, advertiser-driven design of these technologies. And I've always seen it that way. So when we first did our campaign to enact the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, we really wanted to curtail some of those, many of those mechanisms that were being built into the system that were addictive. It was all just starting, but we've seen it evolve, that were designed to engage young people, to manipulate them, to use their data for purposes that were contrary to what may be in their best in their own interests as developing young people. So I think we have to look at it in a very systemic way and not just in terms of privacy. And I don't like to see it narrowed so much to just data collection because I've never really viewed it that way. But we were working within a regulatory system and a political context that in the 1990s sort of narrowed our scope in a lot of ways. Beyond, how we might have wanted to do that. But I see privacy as part of a broader set of concerns and issues that have to do with the overall well-being of the child.
So if I could just ask a quick clarifying question, then is it sort of this idea that some of these advertising practices can undermine a child's autonomy or agency? Is that sort of how you see that?
Absolutely. And in social media, they take advantage of, tap into, and in many ways manipulate, for example, your peer relationships. They're designing these systems around your need as a young person to develop your own sense of who you are in the world. But the marketers and advertisers have built that into their system so that you're being viewed as part of a branding experience, and that's being kind of mirrored to you. And that's based on how they collect your behavioral patterns, your interactions with other people, what you say about yourself. It's all totally woven into that system that's trying to take advantage of what is a normal developmental process for young people.
Thank you.
And Jeff, Catherine explained it beautifully. I would just add that a lot of the conversations I have with parents about privacy and the relationship to social media and mental health and those risks and harms, I think goes to this notion of the grocery store and unhealthy foods that parents want. They want notice, they want transparency, they want information about what's unhealthy. They want to provide consent, so they want to have agency, to your point. They want to have autonomy. They want to have that control, and they want to be respected. So I think when, whether it's social media or other types of technologies, there is no respect, there is no trust. The data is used to Catherine's point, is exploited for commercial purposes, for profit, for different companies. Your behaviors or intentions or beliefs are manipulated, your susceptibility for profit, for commercial gain. I think that's where parents get that creepy factor where this wasn't transparent. They didn't have notice. They didn't provide consent to that. And that, of course, leads to the addictive behavior, mental health, and that's a much deeper conversation. But I think that's the relationship.
Thank you. That does help. So it does seem to be the connection is around self-determination as the avenue to well-being. One last clarifying question. In the note that Sonia put up that Meta was using to drawing on the child rights framework, I saw it said 0 to 17. Do the three of you have an idea where specialized rights or concerns end in the developmental span? And if so, could you give us some thinking as to why you would choose that age?
So if I may start, a child rights framework formally is 0 to 17. So I think they are trying to fit with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Whether those, I think, is your implication, under that age, but above the copper age merit special protections is one question, and whether we go with those who say that adolescence or youth actually extends into the 20s and requires extended protections. I think that's a different and also important question. But I'm adopting a child rights framework, so that I'm going with the legal definition. It's contentious enough.
Well, and I would agree with Sonia. It's tough. It's really difficult because, to establish it in policy, because you have legal considerations, you have political considerations, you have global frameworks and you have national frameworks. But it seems to me that there's enough of a tradition around 18 and under 18 for protections in a lot of other areas that I think that makes a lot of sense. You have to ultimately be pragmatic about it. Yes, I know that there's a lot of scientific literature about brain development, and any of us who have been parents have seen that in our own children. They don't become automatically mature adults at 18, and some of them are well into their 20s before you see that maturity really happening. but you have to balance the sort of legal traditions, I think, with some of the pragmatic considerations. I have just will repeat what I said before. I am so gratified that we're now talking about teens, because for so long they were not talked about. Industry wouldn't touch it, government wouldn't touch it. Now we're having a really, really deep conversation about teens and what they need.
Thank you. Sonia, go ahead.
I was just going to add very briefly, I don't think it's accidental that the idea of an age-appropriate design code has kind of taken off in many countries. I think there is a real desire for the digital world to address young people according to their age and in a rights language, their evolving capacity, which is to recognise that even by age, not every 13-year-old is equally competent, resilient or vulnerable. So the desire is there, I think, to treat young people where they are and according to their needs. But the digital design and business model challenge, I think, is very, very serious.
I'm going to jump in with a question of my own. Catherine, you mentioned curbing engagement techniques, and I would just be curious to hear a bit more about recommendations or ideas and issues that have been raised in that conversation.
I don't have off the top of my head some very clear examples to present to you, but other people have talked about it. The algorithms that encourage you to stay on a site for a long time, that send you more content based on what your interests are. And in some cases that might be content that's very harmful to you, but the whole system is built around that. And I think we need to look very closely at what those mechanisms are for engagement in each case. I mean, back in the olden days, when I started this work, the industry talked about sticky content. I can still remember this idea that, you're going to put your hand somewhere and you can't disengage your hands because it's designed to keep you involved in it. And it's become really highly sophisticated and it's tested on a regular basis. So, they know when you disengage, and they will send you information that will guarantee that you will stay engaged.
Thank you. Taryn.
Thank you, Catherine. I was fascinated with a number of things, but one of the things that you mentioned that also connects to one other talk from yesterday is sort of this idea around sort of public option for, conceptually, I think some of these things that you covered relate to sort of public option for social media, if you will. So I'm curious if you can elaborate a little bit on what do you think are some roadblocks right now, as opposed to, I think there were some discussions of sort of past explorations
about whether it could be a public system. I don't want to be cynical. I think it's really difficult, and maybe other people have other recommendations to offer, but I think we were at a point many years ago where we might have been able to go with a more public system. I think the more we think about design and building in age appropriate by design, it's going to come into conflict with the business model and the commercial imperatives that drive this business. And it may, in fact, affect the profit-making abilities of some of these companies, perhaps, if what they are doing, they have to stop doing. And if we want to take into account what's best in the best interest of young people, it would be good if we could think about other models. I don't have any ideas. I'll be honest with you. I've not been looking at this recently. I am interested if anybody else has looked at places where some of this might be happening. Or, one other thing I'll just throw in is companies may be realizing that there may have to be cross subsidies. They may not be able to make as much money off of children and teens as they made before. But it's, if they do it right, it's going to change things, and it's going to challenge them.
Thank you. Sonia?
I was just going to make a point about scope for public interventions, even though not a fully public system. I'm curious about what benefit would be brought if these principles were built into procurement rules for products that were receive public funds. So I'm thinking of EdTech in schools, or uses of digital technologies in the health sector. Or there must be a range of others, or when products get co-developed with public organizations or with museums or with communities and so forth. I think if there were kind of normative standards and rules that got built into procurement, that would change the game in a sufficient portion of the market that it might set standards that would change public expectations. I'm an optimist.
I will go with that. I like that kind of thinking. I like that kind of thinking.
Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been very fascinating listening to this. I'm wondering about, how we have a rating system for video games and for, movies and all those kinds of things. Could you envision a rating system that said you are being manipulated, under such and such age, you will be, you're being manipulated, or, something that kind of just very bluntly says that there are things going on that might be above and beyond a child's ability to really consent to continue with whatever the vehicle is, whatever the thing is. How do you, with such enormous economic benefits from having these kinds of sites and not having a government site, and it just seems like, how do we actually get a handle on this, or at least give people the warning, you are now entering a space where your child, or this might be a space where they won't really have the ability to have any self-determination.
And I'll quickly add, Leslie, I think that's a great idea. At Common Sense, we try to use the market effects to let parents vote with their data, vote with their feet, choose better privacy protecting products for themselves and their children, kind of that unhealthy, healthy distinction. But it's difficult. I think it's going to require both a change in attitudes, change in awareness, change in perception of social media's impact on youth and mental health, but also policymakers and regulators because of all these new types of emerging data. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and at Common Sense, we're trying to help with some of those warning ratings, just to let you know that this product is going to use your data for commercial purposes, which it's hard for different parents and educated audiences. They don't know a lot of the different contexts about how data can be used for education or at home for kids. That's, I think, a good starting place for that conversation. But I agree, a lot more awareness needs to happen around this space.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? I have one in my notes. Oh, okay, go ahead. Oop, where'd it go?
Well, Amanda, I was just going to say that there
Yeah.
are some Q&As there. If you, they're similar and they're for Gerard.
Okay. So one is, Mr. Kelly, do you agree that the VR technology should not be used in schools for the reasons you articulated?
Yes, yes. And we've talked to educators and technologists and different integrators in schools and districts across the country who are actively talking to folks like Meta and HP and others. And because when it comes to the educational environment, there are different state student data privacy laws in the US and a federal student data privacy law. So there are more protections for students in that context, which is why it's a little more difficult for VR manufacturers today to use those devices in computer labs and other e-sport programs in schools and districts. But hopefully by our report putting pressure on vendors, schools and districts putting pressure on these manufacturers as well, that will change their policies and practices, at least in regards to K-12 education. Hopefully new VR manufacturers will enter the space as well with more privacy protecting devices. But for right now, we're not recommending any of these devices for use by kids or students in K-12.
Thank you. Karen?
Gerard, this is for you. As the committee, we're concerned with not only the harms, but also the benefits. And I think you told us, really informed us quite a lot about the harms, and this has been super helpful. And I know that's not where your focus is, but I'm wondering if you can speak to specific sort of benefits of VR, maybe even in comparison to other sort of social media sort of platforms and solutions that we should be keeping in mind, and as we are thinking through that particular technology.
Yeah, and I did focus a lot on their privacy risks and harms, but as with any new emerging technology, there are many different types of benefits in the educational context. We've already talked to teachers and students who've used the devices, for example, in these immersive environments, to shrink down to the size of a cell, like in the Magic School Bus, and learn about biology in ways that you just really can't get from a textbook or from a web browser. And kids react differently to those experiences, right? And are able to engage and have different interactions that were not possible before without this emerging technology. Other examples include playing your favorite character in a book, right? So acting out a different scene in different books, or learning about the solar system, or science, or math, or artwork. There's so many beneficial uses for learning, for engagement, for interactions. But we need to make sure that that's a safe place for kids, just like school, or just like the playground, right? That we're not just opening them up to any interaction with any stranger for any purpose. So I see a lot of benefits. I do kind of make the joke that I think virtual reality is kind of having its Windows 95 moment, where it's very simple right now. It's still developing. There's not a lot of use cases for it yet, which is why I think a lot of kids and students are not using them. And cost is another prohibitive factor. These are really expensive devices, but just like laptops and personal computers and mobile phones that were thousands of dollars a decade ago, the prices are coming down quickly, and we see these growing in adoption and investment. We're seeing Apple potentially releasing their own device this year with mobile apps and games and other experiences that are beneficial for kids. But I think we always need to think about what's happening behind the scenes in those experiences, not just for privacy, right, about how their data is collected and how it's used, but also safety. So also those interactions, having those age appropriate, privacy by design settings and controls that by default, right, that you slowly open up as you are age appropriate in different contexts and different situations, which can be beneficial, right, to meet new people who have a shared interest or passion in these environments. And I know Minecraft is an exploding environment where teens are having these social interactions and meeting folks in these environments and learning to work together collaboratively. So a lot of benefits, but I think like any emerging technology, we want to try to get ahead of this a little bit and really bake in privacy now and safety now and what that means for kids and mental health.
Thank you. Other questions from our group or?
There are no other questions, Amanda. I think we can maybe take a break for 10 minutes. When we get going, just to make sure we stay on time. And welcome back, everybody. I'm going to turn this panel over to Stephanie Reich, Professor at University of California, Irvine, who is going to moderate. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you. And it's a bad allergy day, so I'm hoping I won't cough or wheeze through this, but let's see how it goes. So our afternoon panel is on data collection and privacy. I've been asked to not do long introductions because that will suck up all the time. And so each person has been asked a specific question. They have about 5 minutes to respond. We'll save the questions till the end so we can have more of a discussion. Are all the presenters on currently? Okay, good. So we're going to start actually with Hector Valderes, who is president of Northern New Mexico College. The question he was asked is that concerns about children's data privacy and parental consent are complicated when the technology in question is used in schools. Mr. Valderas, when you were Attorney General of New Mexico, you brought a case against Google dealing with this question and with companies circumventing requirements to provide parents direct notice of their data collection policies. Could you tell us more about this case and its outcomes?
Sure. Thank you for having me on really such an important issue. My involvement in the lawsuit was twofold: to mitigate risk, or risks, I should say, because there was just simply not enough oversight or protections to protect the collection of data, especially for minors, children that are operating on the internet without parental consent, or really appreciating the risks of data collection, like their location or personal information. And secondly, what frustrated me was the model is fairly unregulated in this country. In other words, the Congress and law enforcement are decades behind, years behind in appreciating the risks. There simply are no internet police to protect inappropriate collection of data for children. And then finally, because I litigate consumer protection issues and marketplace corrections, in further understanding there were no protections or regulations to protect children that were being enforced. Secondarily, I brought the litigation to try to improve some kind of market correction. The monetization of data, particularly children, and then being resold, really is the fuel that is also adding to the risk of us not appreciating data collection as parents. And more importantly, as we see a proliferation where there's a blending of school settings or safe zones in the marketplace. And I will close with, I began suing Google to protect data of children, but I ended up suing Google as well on the proliferation of them using our location for adults and children. And so you see a merging where I just don't believe that there are adequate safe zones, considering some of these marketplace risk factors. And more importantly, that most law enforcement and members of Congress don't quite appreciate the evolving technology. I've made the argument that most of us as parents will safeguard risks to our children, but we assume those risks are not coming through the computer or telephones in our bedrooms. We simply are just generations behind. And every year we see younger and younger children being exposed to the private marketplace, and we see a blending of commercial products in which parents just can't simply distinguish or apply safe settings. So for me, it was to mitigate risk and to try to make some positive impact in the marketplace. We were one of the few attorneys general in the country, but I'm confident that we will see more, and we will see more federal interventions. But quite frankly, we're behind the 8 ball on this several generations.
Thank you. We're going to hold questions to the end so we can have a more meaty discussion. The next one is for Emily Churkin, who is a co-chair of Screens in School Work Group for Fair Play for Kids Action Network. Ms. Churkin, you and your colleagues at Fair Play for Kids Action Network have a concern about the ways education technology companies can collect and use children's personal information. Particularly since the pandemic began and online schooling became the norm for most children in the country. Could you describe the types of information the companies collect, the harms you see those opposing, or what your concerns are?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for having me. My name is Emily Churkin. I am a former middle school classroom teacher. I helped co-found the Student Data Privacy Project. I'm a member of the Screens in Schools Action Network. I'm also the screen time consultant. I live in Seattle and I'm a parent activist in the district. So I wear a lot of different hats. And I really see that there are 2 problems at work here. One is the question you just asked me, which is how and the ways that ed tech collects data about children and the risk that that poses. But the second, and I would argue even larger problem that we've been hearing about today is the increased use of technology by schools and how that contributes to the broader use of and overuse of screen-based technology by children in general. So I have a couple of short slides. Can I do a quick share here? Yeah. So I just want to make sure I had the data up so we could see it. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so your question was, what data do EdTech platforms collect? This is a short list. So geographic location, age, birth date, login numbers, keystrokes, mouse movements, clicks, sexual orientation, religious affiliations, family economic status, race, ethnicity, grades, test scores, behavior records, and much, much more. In many cases, these pieces of information that are being used to track student interactions can then be used to make algorithmic predictions about honesty, attainment, and comprehension. The second thing I want to show you is that, too fast. There we go. The K-12 EdTech Safety Benchmark Report recently found several serious and disturbing risks to student personal information. For example, 96% of all apps reviewed shared children's personal information with third parties. 28% of those technologies used by schools were non-education specific, like YouTube and Spotify. 23% exposed children to digital ads. 40% of schools on average are using about 125 EdTech platforms per school, with one school using a whopping 1,411. So in the summer of 2020, my colleagues and I co-founded the Student Data Privacy Project to test the efficacy of federal student data privacy laws. We recruited parent volunteers from around the country to request data collected by EdTech vendors about their children. We didn't have much success, but in we had success getting parent volunteers, but when we filed complaints with the Department of Education in person in July of 21, we did not get much of a response, and we are still waiting. Our goal in filing the complaints was to hope that school districts would think twice before signing more contracts with EdTech companies. We thought that if FERPA were better enforced, as it should be, then schools might move towards more intentional relationships with technology companies. However, we have yet to see that happening. Our Student Data Privacy Project found that FERPA is indeed not being enforced. While many schools refused to even respond to the parent volunteers' request or sent student login information and not actual data, one parent we worked with got 2,000 files from her district, some of which included baby video photos and videos of her child doing yoga in her bedroom for an online PE class. And we share these with permission. Because the DOE is not responding to complaints, we're looking for other ways to get EdTech platforms and practices to be held, or school districts to hold EdTech accountable. We did recently meet with the FTC, and we're hoping to see if they would consider using COPPA as a way to help us push the needle on this. At the end of the day, of course, as all of you know, technology companies are profiting off children's data while putting long-term privacy at risk. But again, our concern also is that it is overuse of screens in general. It's a cumulative effect. Parents are regularly reporting harms like isolation, depression, anxiety. It's not just a problem for kids, it's a problem for families. And as schools have increased the use of tech, parents are faced with this dual challenge of managing and monitoring screens for school, as well as personal device use, not to mention our own personal challenges as adults. So as you've been hearing, data is catching up to show us the implications of mental harms and emotional, cognitive, physical harms being done to children. This is no surprise to us that have worked with children for many years. And increased time on screens, we know, displaces really important childhood experiences. Unfortunately, and exacerbated by the pandemic, as you point out, is that school districts are increasingly turning to and investing in very expensive EdTech platforms with little to no oversight or transparency, and often with disproportionate impact. We resist the notion that struggling schools are made better by more tech. While we do believe there's a time and a place for developmentally appropriate technology use in schools, the current state of things is anything but that. As you've likely heard, my own school district in Seattle recently filed a lawsuit against social media companies claiming that student use of mental health platforms was negatively impacting student mental health. I agree. Social media is highly problematic to youth mental health, but I see this lawsuit as a deflection from schools' own complicity in the problem. It's not just social media platforms that harm children, nor even the collection of data by ed tech companies. It's the cumulative effect of so much screen-based exposure embedded with manipulative techniques and gamified algorithms for the benefit of technology companies that is contributing to the harm being done. My own daughter, as a student, is provided with her own laptop on which she can access sites like Pinterest, regularly where porn is now found by children, and YouTube, where algorithms feed content. Not only do ed tech platforms collect and profit off student data, but they also rely on the same manipulative techniques that social media companies are using. Just as one example, IXL, used by over 14 million students, provides a leaderboard when students log in, ranking students in the class with first name and last name, not just by the questions they've answered or the skills they've mastered, but by the amount of time they have spent in the app. This ranking of children against one another and rewarding them for their time spent in the app is deeply problematic. Asking an 11-year-old to stay focused in class while on a laptop is absurd. Comparing her progress to peers is psychologically manipulative. Children are not developmentally capable of this level of self-control or emotion regulation. Asking them to do this is, as my colleague describes it, like holding an AA meeting in a bar. Attempting to address these issues does feel at times like digital whack-a-mole, as I like to say. Those of us with a voice and power to affect meaningful change must do so based both on independent research and on what is developmentally in the best interest of children, not technology companies. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, next we have Sunju Grace On, who is a professor at the University of Georgia. You were asked, virtual reality systems, in order to work properly, must track and record users' body movements. Dr. On, could you comment on how product developers might use these physical data? Do these uses raise some unique challenges for privacy?
And I think we've covered a lot of ground on that in the prior session. As we've heard from many others on this panel as well, data collection with regards to consumer behavior and user behavior is not necessarily new. What is concerning about the virtual reality aspect of it is the granularity of the data that you're able to get through user behavior tracking. A lot of the VR headsets currently out on the market are also integrated with eye tracking. And so you're also able to see exactly where the user is looking, how long the user is looking, and how fast the movements are happening at every millisecond and every millimeter. And so that granularity of data is able to just give you a clearer picture of the user compared to, let's say, click-through rates or other means of data collection, geospatial data collection that we've had up until this point. So I think the greatest threat that we're facing from these technology companies is that they're able to get a much more identifiable information about the individual user compared to the other sources of information that they were able to get in using other non-VR methods. And it's a difficult question regarding privacy because that granularity of data can, on the flip side, inspire a lot of good things that we've also discussed in terms of education or health or distance learning and or even remote working. And so a lot of this information can be used for good, but on the flip side, without protection and without any accountability is where we are facing problems. And so I think I do want to note that we don't want to, throw out the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. And so we do need to keep in mind that a lot of these information and data collected at that granular level can be used for good and for educational purposes. And I think the biggest challenge that parents face with this emerging rush of technology is that the learning curve is very steep. And there's a lot of burden placed on the parents to try to learn the new headsets that hit the market every 6 months. And it's just not feasible for an everyday consumer to learn all the ins and outs and bells and whistles of what their children are playing with at the moment. And so expecting parents to be at the forefront of this cutting edge technology and understanding the privacy risks is virtually impossible. It's setting them up for failure. And that's where I think the companies need to be accountable to make it easier for parents to be able to say what they're okay with and what they're not okay with. And I think it might be easy to, think that parents are always, or consumers are always going to guard their privacy with their life. But a lot of the studies demonstrate that if, let's say, for example, advertisements are informative and have utility, then consumers are willing to make that decision to exchange their private information or any sort of information that they are willing to give in return for that high utility of information. But what's the key word here is transparency. So they know what they're exchanging for, and their privacy or the value that they attach to their private information needs to be really transparent. And I think that part is highly lacking, especially with these emerging technologies. And so we see a lot of utility and good that can come with it. It's just there is almost zero control and zero oversight at this point, which can be a formula for disaster very quickly in the future. And so that would be, I think, my most concerning point.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Joe Turro, who is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Turro, when we talk about the privacy trade-offs associated with use of digital technology, the discussion often turns to strategies to improve user sophistication and understanding how these systems work. We just heard that the burden is often placed on parents. Could you discuss the strengths and limitations of media literacy strategies, especially with young people?
Thank you for having me. I'm not going to focus that much on young people because I don't know enough about them. The people here invited me, even though I said I don't know much about young people, except I had some. I have a number of them and grandchildren. But what I want to emphasize takes off from where Professor Ron left off. We find that parents, presumably, and most Americans are woefully ignorant when it comes to anything related to internet marketing. In fact, we just released a study today that people can look at. It was written up in the New York Times, so you can go to the Times one and click on the link and you can read the entire study. And basically the study says that consent, which is the dominant way in which Americans sort of give up their information, is broken when it comes to the internet. Opt-out consent, which is mostly what Americans do, and even opt-in consent. We find that Americans are woefully ignorant when it comes to anything about, we gave them a 17-question quiz, you might say, of practices and policies relating to the internet. Questions, for example, like, by law, a travel site such as Expedia or Orbitz that compares prices on different airlines does not have to include the lowest airline prices. Turns out 72% don't know the answer. Okay, and 49% of Americans admit they don't know the answer. Another one, and these are important, the Federal Health Insurance and Portability Act, HIPAA, does not stop apps selling data collected about the app's users to marketers. 82% of Americans don't know the answer, and 49% admit they don't know it. Another one, it's legal for an online store to charge people different prices depending on where they're located. 63% don't know the answer. 38% admit they don't know the answer. Could you put? I had the grading of Americans that on these 17, and people can look at all 17 questions online, and the Times has a chart. 77% of Americans got at the most 9 of these correct. That means they scored 53%. The rest got basically D. Only one person in over 2,000 of this representative sample done by the NORC at the University of Chicago, only one person got an A, which was 16 out of 17. The other thing about it is that we looked at, so that there are 2 aspects of consent, and you can get this from, say, medical issues about informed consent. One is knowledge, knowing what's going on and being able to track it. The second is having a perception of autonomy. And we found that in both cases, Americans are woefully bad at this. You can see that they're bad at knowledge in terms of the kinds of things they think about their autonomy on the web. It's disastrous. I think the next slide talks about this. No, this is about sort of trade-offs, which I can talk about as well. People, a lot of the marketing industry says that people are into trade-offs. We found that when it comes to people thinking about trade-offs, they don't believe that at all. If a company gives me a discount, it's a fair exchange for them to collect information about me without my knowing it. 88% disagree with that. If I log on to a store's Wi-Fi, it's fair for them to monitor what I'm doing online while I'm in the store. 68% disagree. It's okay if the store where I shop uses information about me to create a picture of me that improves the services they provide for me. Even 61% disagree. So then you say, well, why do people keep giving up their data? And what we end up showing in this report and other stuff that we've done, it has nothing to do with believing in trade-offs. It has to do with resignation. And we have a lot of different questions that we ask people in very nuanced ways about what they think about their autonomy online. The most important two, which would create a kind of sense of measure of resignation, is one, I would like to control the data companies have about me. And the other is, I've come to believe that I can't control what companies learn about me online. And these are not always connected, they're randomly distributed. And we found that 70% of Americans are resigned to the idea that companies are going to take away their data and they can't control it. And a huge percentage of these say that they believe what companies take about them can harm them. So we're in a situation where people don't know basic and important questions about the internet, and they have no trust in the companies, and they believe they can't do anything about it, and they believe they're harmed regarding it. Okay? Is that a situation where you can say that people have informed consent? Is that a situation where parents can tell anything to their kids? I wonder what American teachers would get when it comes to this quiz. Okay? I teach students every year, freshmen. I've been doing it for decades. I have maybe one person in the entire class of 70, 80 people who's taken a course on the internet coming into my class as a freshman. They don't learn anything as high school students, maybe a class here and there. And so we're in a situation where the teachers don't know, the parents don't know, and we have to get real about this. We suggest that the entire regime of consent is broken, and that the way to solve the problem for advertisers is to basically only allow contextual advertising. Contextual advertising is the notion that a person sees an ad based upon the context that he or she is in. So if you're in a pet web or app and you're looking at dogs, they can send you ads about dogs, or if the AI, if their artificial intelligence says that people who like dogs like other things, you can send them an ad for that. But you're not allowed to store the information, and you're not allowed to track them across other places, and you're not allowed to really use cookies in the way that traditionally have been used, or trackers of any sort. The thing is that as people learn what companies are doing now, companies are rushing far ahead of them. Connected TVs are watching us while we watch. They're sending ads to your phone based on what you're doing online. It took me, I once went to my LG TV set to watch a Buster Keaton movie on YouTube that I was going to show part of in class. It required me to say yes to tracking. I couldn't figure out how to stop it. And I teach this stuff for a living. So we're in a really interesting point, an inflection point. We've had 30 years of this stuff reaching the kind of world that we're in, and we're moving to biometrics, voice, and facial recognition. So the idea here is that we have to talk reality about this. It's important to have media education. It's important to have media literacy for many, many reasons, but it doesn't solve the problem of consent.
Thank you for that. And I thought I was going to have to please time, but you all did so well. We can actually have a rich discussion, and maybe I can ask even a bigger question than I intended. Joy, as a moderator, as I get to start the discussions. So, we start off hearing that maybe you could have legislation to correct the marketplace. Then we heard that you actually have legislation, FERPA, COPA, that doesn't actually ever get enacted. And we've heard previously that, maybe penalties are worth it because you still got all those data, right? And so, and then we have the sense of that the burden consent doesn't work. We heard that today, we heard that yesterday. Media literacy is not the solution. So each of you work in very different spaces, but I'm curious if you have a vision of what would be ideal. Like if you controlled, or like, what is it that you think are the pieces that are really needed to fix some of these privacy issues?
Well, I just said my piece about that in terms of contextual advertising. It is not as much of a disaster for advertisers as they think. I know some advertising consultants who believe that the whole edifice of target marketing is a chimera. It's just built on sand, and it's not nearly as effective as people make it out to be. Be that as it may, though, we live in a society where we have to care about the citizens. And I think that that has to be a first priority, and legislators have to step up. We asked people whether they think Congress should be involved, and near 80% of them said that they should act now in order to do something about this. Yeah, so it's not easy. There are no easy answers to this. You can't just teach people out of it because marketers are way ahead of all of us.
I would argue the same thing, that it's a multifaceted approach. I think what I see with my work with parents is exactly what I'm hearing my colleagues here say, which is that parents have no idea what's going on or are woefully ignorant or naive about it. And the rapidly changing nature of it just feels like I'd rather just not have the fight. I also think that one of the important things about research itself is how we can make sure that we're discerning what is independent research from what's industry funded, because I think that is often tossed into the mix and blurred with all the other stuff like, oh, look, this is actually all good for children. And it is, as all these colleagues have said, very nuanced. And so it's not a just one size fits all. I think it needs to be a multifaceted approach. So I agree with Dr. Trupp.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe add a strategic idea as well. In a marketplace where the deck is stacked against families and children, the idea I would have is that the potential improvement in the marketplace for children is a market-based solution. In other words, part of why we aren't able to level the playing field is the first debate really should be about who owns the data. So these companies are monetizing children's data and they're selling, and that's why they place their security and their privacy secondary to the market. But if parents really believe that, look, my kid at least deserves a check, if you're going to exploit, and I think that the tech solutions would then begin to see the power shift where we as consumers, we can't beat you in the safety game. We can't beat you in manipulating Congress, but if we had basic privacy protections based in property right, you might be able to then see a shift where technology companies and then consumers start demanding their fair share of the pie. This is all about greed as well. And for some reason, Congress wants to continue to allow these ridiculous disclaimers where if I use the device in the app, my child does not own that data. It's the private company enterprise. And so I think changing the battlefield a little bit around and using the rich history we have in terms of property interests, you would never see private property rights being upended, or the protections with medical privacy are different. And I believe they're in the foundations because patients start off the argument that we own that information. The medical information is mine, not some private company you can then monetize and sell. So I think we definitely have, the odds are against families and consumers, but I'm hoping that maybe Congress's promotion of self-interest in terms of consumers, that we at least deserve a fair share. If you're going to exploit our children, you should at least shift some of the profiteering over to the consumers, just like we've seen in the auto industry. You know, Ford Pintos used to blow up, and we used to sell cars without seatbelts. The consumer at some point, through competition, began to see those safety improvements, not because they're good guys, but because they've been marketing and consumers had a choice between tech products. So just a long shot, but in my a little creative advice on many lost battles when it comes to child privacy.
Can I break in here for a moment? Do you mind? I think it's an interesting notion to talk about people owning data. I want to talk about it in two ways. One, I don't think it's a good idea to encourage people to sell their data because they really wouldn't know what they're selling. Companies, again, are far ahead of people in terms of AI. It's not clear at all what people know. But the other thing that's really important to think about is the question of harm. The Federal Trade Commission and a lot of other agencies have never been able to get past harm being physical or monetary harm. And that's a problem, because if we think about harm when it comes to issues of the internet, a lot of times it's much more sociocultural and long-term historical harm. It's a person losing her dignity. It's a person worrying about whether the fact that she used a fertility app will be tracked by somebody who might cause her reputational harm. And only she and a few other people will know it. There are lots of ways in which harm can be described that are not as mechanistic as the kinds of traditional harms. And I think we have to figure out ways to do this. I understand why harm is considered economic and physical. It's easy, but we're in a new world here. And I think we have to face up to the idea. I do think that allowing people to trade on their data or data about them is problematical for lots of reasons I can get into, but it's opening a Pandora's box.
Dr. Ron, is there anything you wanted to share on this before we open it up?
Yeah, I was wondering about how much we get to determine in terms of consumer empowerment. If we say that we're going to protect the consumers, we're going to protect children, up to what extent do we give the reins back to the consumers? And to what extent do we say we're going to protect you from all harm, or at least we're going to try? And so that is a really slippery slope. I was recently at another conference about the metaverse and the youth, and we were discussing the idea of having children become their own change agents. And so if we are interested in getting children to know a little bit more about the world that they're growing up in, how far and to what extent can we protect them? So are we saying up until age 13, you don't get to see any of this, but then magically after 13 and one day, do we release it? Right? Yeah. And so it's a really slippery slope.
And if I'm not correctly, sorry.
I would love to just add that we cannot conflate what children are doing and experiencing is the same as what adults are experiencing when it comes to digital tech, because children's brains are not adult brains. And I think too often we make the assumption that we just do what we did for adults for children, and that's not it at all. The prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed till we're well into our 20s or 30s. And so I think, again, until the bottom line for the tech companies is that it's more profitable to protect children rather than to, they can make more money that way, nothing is going to change. I mean, I am an optimist, but I have some cynicism about that business model. I
agree. And I mean, children are on, before they talk, they start asking for a Wi-Fi signal. We're talking about 3-year-olds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my granddaughter walked around the apartment saying, Alexa, Alexa, because she somehow thought there was this magical thing called Alexa around,
Yeah, I mean, they learn that we are, what do they call it? We are tech immigrants. So in other words, what 3-year-old already mastered the tech language in terms of how to use all these devices, how to maximize them, how to get past screens. And me and my children are now, they're turning off these devices for their grandfather. I mean, it's also about language, and realistically, they're being exposed to these sophisticated units. 3 or 4, it's just mind-boggling that they're looking for Wi-Fi signals.
But they don't understand, and even the teenagers don't understand, and their parents and people in their 30s and 40s don't understand the business behind the screen.
No, exactly.
That's
Perhaps
the real
this is the intersection between what Emily had to share too, right? Perhaps this is like a place where schools have a space around media literacy within the platforms or privacy mechanisms.
Yeah,
I want to be sure to make some
Oh,
space.
sorry. I was just
ahead.
going to say that the parents are getting very mixed messages too from the schools. It's all about STEM education. You need to, teach your kids about technology. This is the world that they're growing up in. But there's not a lot of equal emphasis on what happens on the back end of things. So they see a lot of screens and it's all magical. Put on the VR headset, you travel to a different world, but there's not a lot of description on what happens on the back end of things. And I think parents are capable of understanding. They're just not exposed to that information from the get-go. The communication that I get from my kids' middle school is that this is just going to be a magical solution for all the problems that we have, which is not necessarily the case. And so equal emphasis on here's what you're seeing on the front end, but here's what's happening on the back end, I think needs to happen as well when we're communicating to the parents.
And parents don't know what their kids are consenting to by using the platforms that schools are using. So even knowing what's on the back end, they've already consented to stuff without any awareness of it or what's being done with it.
How many people here have read an entire privacy policy? Very, very, and you're professionals. The idea, try to read the Facebook privacy policy and understand it. I had a graduate student do that recently and underline things that he thought he and others would find ambiguous or problematical until we started really looking into, and virtually every paragraph had a couple of terms. Try to go to the Target privacy policy, and you can't do it. There is no way to understand this stuff seriously unless you have a legal background in that material. Why should we expect teachers to know this stuff? And why should we expect parents to know this stuff?
That's a good point. All right, I'm going to open it up to other members of the panel to be able, or the committee to be able to talk to the panelists. Sharon, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. Very interesting ideas to think through. My question is to Dr. Taro. I'm really intrigued by this idea that the solution to this is anything but the contextual ads, and I'm guessing maybe like search ads, which is, I guess, contextual, yeah,
it can be contextual.
Removing, basically stopping them is the solution. I asked this question as someone who, back in the day when we're trying to understand the do not track policy, we're trying to understand what would be the impact on the web economy, and we were trying to make the case that it is not going to be as detrimental as you might think. But we did get a lot of pushback. It is, at the end of the day, the arguments that are made is that that's sort of the backbone of the internet economy, web economy, and content providers are relying on it, and the consumers are in turn relying on having access to free content. So tying what you said in this conversation to more closely to our task as a committee, as focusing on the harms and benefits to children and adolescents, I'm wondering, what would you say about that? Seems like a really blunt instrument of no ad, all display ads gone.
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
Not all display ads, any kind of advertising.
Sorry, targeted display ads, I guess.
Yes.
And again, I'm asking this. I'm not asking this because I don't necessarily believe that's not.
Ask away. This is
yes.
Part of the reason we made that suggestion is to start a conversation.
Yeah. So I guess the question I have is that it does seem like a sort of solution that would get a lot of pushback from a lot. Very powerful stakeholders.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, thinking through specifically about harms to children and adolescents, can you, maybe they might be less ideal to you, but are there other solutions that you think in this display, in the advertising ecosystem, that one can think through with that primary goal, and not necessarily, even us, like you said, even as adults, like we don't know what's happening, but focusing primarily on kids, and especially risks and harms. Are there other sort of solutions that you might think and maybe say, okay, I'm still going for anything but contextual ads or is bad, but not considered?
First of all, that the 13-year-old business, the idea that they have to be under, was it 12, right? To be considered an adult, you're over 12. That was a negotiation with the industry. People wanted to make it 16. I mean, and as Dr. Ron said, I think it's Dr. Ron, that all of a sudden there's this all of a sudden a fence that says, okay, now you're an adult, is kind of crazy. We have to figure out what the heck that means. But beyond that, the idea, the easy way to say it for me would be to say, let's do opt-in. Everybody does opt-in, okay? And then what we could figure out is have them say, not just accept, now it says accept or learn more, which is interesting. But you take most people. Now, I was going to say the typical teenager, but that's wrong. I don't want to stereotype. You need to go to an app. The reason you're going to an app on your phone is because you want to really see something. Okay, so you've told Apple that you don't want the thing to share it with other companies, right? But are you going to opt out? What if you're asked to opt into a particular app's tracking of yourself, okay, on the app? You're going to say, okay, fine, I want to do this. Goodbye. Let me use the app already. There's a desire to get into the material. And companies have learned recently, not as much as they would like, but it will happen, how to get people to opt in. It's what we've begun to call seductive surveillance. Something becomes seductive, Siri is seductive, Alexa is seductive. And you share yourself with these assistants because you want to use them, the price is right, and it becomes part of your life. It's not just apps and websites we're talking about now. It's voice control. My book, The Voice Catches, is about how companies now have the ability to listen to your voice, do a voice print, and actually try to figure out, quote unquote, your emotions based upon that, and then use that. And companies do this already. So on 800 numbers, for example. So it's too easy to say, let's do all opt-in. The Europeans have done that. I'm not so sure it's the best, it's better than opt-out, but it's not a solution.
Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you all for the discussion and the insights, and great to see you, Grace. Been a long time. Been a pandemic. Here's a question that I'm kind of confused by across the four speakers. I get, Grace, your point about responsibilization, and I certainly am, I think, guilty of that when I give advice now that I listen to you. And I'm trying to square that a little bit with what Joe's saying, which is there's no education for anybody on these things. And so I guess what I'm struggling with to try and understand what everybody is saying, and Emily and Hector, feel free to weigh on this, is like, is there an argument here that we need to start like in elementary or high school and have like a full year-long type course that we would develop for, say, like statistics or something like that would be about being a digital citizen? Or is it too late, or that doesn't make sense, and that certainly doesn't help parents, and things are always changing? So I guess what I'm asking is there an education-based solution? And if so, what does that look like for parents and children?
I definitely think there can be, and I think there are some, but I will push back and say it shouldn't come from the tech companies themselves, that these need to be well-funded, independently researched opportunities and curricula. And what ends up happening is districts have budgets, so they go for the low bidders, which are not usually high quality programs, or they're not embedded across K-12. And I would argue there has to be an accompanying parental education component too. I think this is something that's changed so dramatically in 10 years. To Dr. Tro's point, like we are just so woefully behind on all of this. So yes, and I would include in that digital citizenship, democracy and what that means to participate in democracy and how digital use affects that ability. So that's my thought.
Can I also add that I think that we ought to be teaching people how to think about what legislators should do. I don't think we should put onus on the public to be the ones who make decisions about these very complicated things, but we should help people learn how to get in the game of civics engagement. And I think that would be an important thing for media literacy, quote unquote, programs to actualize. I've spoken to people on Capitol Hill who know, I gave a talk once to people on the Hill, and they don't know anything about this stuff either. There are some senators and Congress people and staff people who do, but many people have no clue about it. I'm not exaggerating. And so we need a citizenry that knows how to ask enough questions to put the feet to the fire of their legislators to protect them. I think that's the best we can do.
Yeah, because if we're going to go for an education program for media literacy and have children grow into it and parents learn along with them, that's great, fantastic, but it's a really long-term solution and we need protection pretty much immediately. And there are ways that we can address this technology-wise, because we do this on the researcher end. There is no reason why you would need to scrape all the data, keep it, and reuse it for other purposes to provide the services that these companies are providing. I think there would need to be some sort of a regulation that tech companies have to follow in order to add that layer of transparency as the long-term solution is happening. So on the short term, I think there needs to be greater accountability for the products even before they hit the market. I think right now it's a lot of responsiveness, right? It's sort of the products are out, new VR headsets are pouring out every 3 months, and the response is happening a step too late. All the kids that I see recently are purchasing these $300 devices as Christmas gifts. And it's not unfathomable for parents to purchase these as birthday presents. I mean, I get inquiries from parents all the time. And so clearly we are already behind on this. And so they really need to have a short-term policy in place for tech companies to be able to regulate this even before the product hits the market, before all of the data is already provided, and then we're wringing our arms about it.
It's both and. We need short-term and long-term solutions. Meanwhile, our kids are the guinea pigs right now, but harm is being done and has been done.
Thank you all. A selfish question. This one's for you, Joe. I may have heard, is your position now that media literacy interventions aren't really very effective?
As far as I can tell, they may be effective. I mean, the initial reason is I'm no expert, but the initial thing I read about media literacy, it started to get kids more sensitive to the nuances of what it meant to watch a TV show, to understand how content worked in their lives, that kind of thing. As technologies grew, they became a greater interest in getting people conversant with that. But from the programs that I've looked at, and I'm no expert, very few of them look at, for example, governmental regulation, even at the 8th grade level. They're not that good at stuff like advertising. They'll talk about cookies and stuff like that, but it's not sophisticated to the extent that you really can be an arbiter of your own future. And I don't know that anybody really can. If you look at our study, you could see the number of people who don't know basic things about how things work is phenomenal. The great percentage of Americans get 53% or less in this quiz. And I would argue these are basic questions. So, and not only that, people don't have trust in themselves or companies in terms of dealing with this. So the other thing I might want to say, we're 30 years into this, okay? The commercial internet started in around 1994. We can let this go for another generation, and it'll be even harder to stop. So the notion that this is hard to stop is something that we have to keep. We have to say, where do we want to go? Do we want our grandchildren to take the idea that all data, that there's a sea of data under the world that is tracking them, and they have no ability to do anything about it except accept it? In China, for example, today, I've heard that they use voice to decide if you're a Uyghur or not. Okay, certainly they use facial recognition. Do we want a hidden curriculum that says that to get along in the 21st century, you have to give up your data? That's basically the hidden curriculum that's going on now. So I think we shouldn't be afraid to ask these questions, because in 2 generations, everyone will take this world for granted. And then what do we do? We're not going to be around, but what do they do?
Thank you for that. And it's interesting to think about digital like citizenship interventions right now, right? They're very much structured on how do you function given what the system is now, and how do you figure that out versus questioning what the system is or how, right? Like even if you intervene in early childhood and even through schools, it's still working within a confined space, right? Like getting to the park, you have to cross these streets on these lights. It's not changing where the lights are, where the crosswalks are, right? It's a same path. So I'd like to open it up to others if anyone else has some questions.
There are some interesting new technologies that I heard about in education. I was reading an article about one in Australia. I think it's also used in China, where these video cameras will look at the kids as they work in school. And if a student is not looking at his paper or looking at her teacher, that's considered a bad thing. And parents get to hear that their kids are not doing well based upon these kinesics. And it's craziness, because it assumes certain kinds of norms that people have about the way the world works. And that's just a tiny part. Imagine immigrants coming into a country and people deciding what country you're from based upon what a machine says your voice sounds like. Okay. And there's so many ways it may be accurate, it may not be accurate, but that's the kind of world we're moving into, and we have to be really careful about this stuff.
I think your point about consent is extremely invaluable too, because I hear a lot from parents, even though parents are naive and not informed about a lot of this, they're also pushing it. So I hear all the time, what device should I get my kid to track them so I don't lose track of them when they walk to school? Or, I want to keep tabs on when they go to a friend's house if they really are where they say they are. And of course, there's already apps that allow you to falsify your location, right? Because kids are way savvier than we are. But my concern is this fear-based parenting that's coming out of this too, that this is it. I always use the phrase scary versus dangerous. We're fed the scary 24/7 on our news feeds, on our notifications, but it distracts us from paying attention to what's really dangerous about these products. Like, it's scary to let my kid walk home alone without a phone, but it's dangerous to provide them one where they're not paying attention to their surroundings, or their data is being collected, or they get sucked into a cyberbullying situation, right? And so I think part of the education is also to address that fear-based approach that many parents have that's reinforced by the tech industry in the, if you have this app or if you use this, you'll be a better parent, or you can just monitor your kid with this tech-based tool. And, it's, I think, hugely problematic and misleading.
And what the parents learn about these virtual reality experiences may not be the full story, because what we know from decades of research is that these virtual experiences can transfer into the physical world and continue to impact and influence the way that you think and behave. So what they consent within that virtual experience may not include factors that carry over and continue to impact the way that even kids perceive reality, for example, or how your attitudes may change as a result of this very realistic experience. And so what is included in that consent is also highly debatable.
Now, there are some scholars who have questioned whether, conceptualizations of privacy are just changing with younger people, largely because younger people have had less privacy. I know my own work, like snap location on Snapchat is like a terrifying experience, like for me, because I've been stalked. I'm like, why would I want everyone to know where I am all the time, right? But for youth, when I talk with them, they're so excited that they can see who's hanging out with who and who's where, and they view it as a resource. And their conceptualizations of privacy of where they're physically located is different. And I'm wondering if any of you have any insights on sort of how privacy is changing and the difference of us as like adults thinking about youth spaces versus appreciating how youth think about these spaces and where the protections really intersect.
I mean, teenagers don't like what their parents say, and that's normal. That's developmentally normal. And teenagers' perception and focus is their friends. Their social group is their primary need and takes up all that space in their brain at that age. So I can see why they'd argue that, but that doesn't mean it's better for them. And I think again, it's messages reinforced by social media and tech that say, no, you should want to know where everybody is. And I think that's true that they're experiencing it, but I don't think it actually makes them safer.
To open up, we have one question that came from, through the comment box was just about courses for kids on technology literacy and what does exist, and if there's evidence behind any of that, if any of you could speak to them.
I'm happy to say what I know. I work as a volunteer with Fair Play for Kids, which it was formerly the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood. And there's a lot of really excellent resources for parents on their website. I think, again, my personal belief and professional belief is that this starts with parents. So I think if parents educate themselves, then they can educate and model for their children. But again, I'm wary of anything that's like the quick fix, because this is not going to be fixed overnight.
We also have to realize the socioeconomic relationships here. Every single person in my class, I teach two classes, one with 72 people and one with 15 at the University of Pennsylvania, has an iPhone. iPhones maybe have a better certain kind of approach to privacy than some of the Android phones. One person in the class actually today said that she originally had an Android and decided she had to get an iPhone because she felt like a fish out of water. Okay. Go to another kind of university or college, and it's not that way at all. And there are certain kinds of leaks that certain kinds of phones even have that one has to be worried about. So it's socioeconomic, and that's only one level of the socioeconomic issues involved in how people relate. Some people don't have anything but phones that they rely on for their internet connections. We have to realize how complicated this all is. I've read about kids who go to the sidewalks of schools and use the internet of their school in the evenings on the sidewalk because they don't have internet in their home. This is such a complicated area of life. And we're further complicating it by turning the entire or a large part of it into a commercial business without people knowing anything about how that business operates about them.
All right, I'd like to open it up to Leslie too.
Hi, I'm curious, when we talk about literacy, I know in health, when we talk about literacy, it's a very, in some ways, very paternalistic view of what literacy is, considering, whenever you do studies, 80% of people are health illiterate, which means that the industry is incapable of translating what they're doing. It's not that the people are illiterate. It's, we are not explaining things in a way that makes any sense. And so when we talk about literacy for tech, it's such a movable thing, and whatever we're talking about now won't even be the vehicles in 2015, probably less than that. So it seems like we're talking about guiding principles that we want people to understand and hold close when they're using these kinds of things. And so I'm curious how this industry, or how you have been conceptualizing what health literacy means. It seems to me that having education does two things. One, not just helping people have guiding principles, some understanding of what they're looking at in general, but it also develops people, kids who might be in elementary school and beyond, who might end up going into the field. It kind of introduces them to this work and thinking beyond, where they are. And, I think that would be a helpful thing. So I'm curious how when you talk about literacy, or the industry does, what does that mean? And how can we have guiding principles?
Well, I'm no expert at this stuff, but in my textbook called Media Today, I used the term media literacy to talk in terms of basic principles, but they're more about the use of the understanding that media industries create worlds for us, and that we have to understand that they're part of the constructions of our realities, and that they're a genre that they create, and that we aren't puppets. We're part of a process in which we engage with the materials and sometimes with the companies themselves. But I can't see how, and of course I do have a chapter on the internet. It's the first industry chapter, but I can't see how that would mitigate the concerns that we're talking about today. You can be as media literate. I'm media literate. I spend most of my week trying to understand what's going on in digital media, and there are things that happen that I would never have expected, and that I don't know about. It's too complicated. People have a life, and most people just don't have the time or the energy, the inclination, or the mindset to understand what's happening in these new media that they're facing every day. It's just it's very complicated.
I'd also add again that I think young people are and should be a part of this conversation. When I was teaching middle school for 12 years, the kids loved it when we talked about social media. And I mean, at the time it was Facebook when I was teaching, but when we can help them see, drive their awareness and attention to it, that is far more empowering than, being told don't do this or do that. And, I think the problem is, and I see this in schools all the time, is that a lot of this integrated learning for teachers, when you can embed some of these lessons into content, it doesn't have to be a separate media literacy class. It can be an English class that you talk about the messaging in a book, and that's related to advertising or whatever it is. The problem is that we're competing with standardized testing, which again is a profitable industry that does not take kids' best interests at heart for the most part. And so, it's ends up becoming, again, a choice that people are teachers, I should say, or maybe not even, maybe it's not even a choice, that it's becomes what they have to do. So I think there's a huge cost for that.
And I think a lot of what parents are getting as they send their kids to school is I've seen the pamphlets that come to me from my kids' school district, for example. A lot of it is sort of more focused on the fear mongering. And it's an industry in and of itself.
Absolutely.
Like, look at all the scary stuff that's happening. Buy my book. And that is not media literacy. I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned that we shouldn't be educating these people and throwing a lot of very difficult information to pull them up a certain learning curve. They need to be provided with information that they know sufficient. They don't need to know everything, but they do need to know enough to ask for these changes to happen. And I think that's probably a much more practical target for media literacy. We don't want to educate parents to be media scholars, for example. We want them to know enough to ask, or to say no, or to say yes, right? And that, I think the onus should be on the tech companies to deliver information, like Joe said, not in terms and conditions that are pages and pages of length, and they're intended to be not read by everyday consumers. but it should be transparent enough so that parents are able to make decisions. And the media literacy that we are currently getting as parents is not actually very informative.
And I would just add again that we should be trying to make citizens out of these people. That is, people who can speak to their representatives and say, look, help me so that we don't get abused, okay? That they have enough information to speak legitimately and coherently to their representatives who should know much more and have the facility to ask the right questions to the right people.
And I think historically parents trust what their schools say. And so the problem is that that trust has now been weaponized against them, that they feel like I'm not supposed to push back on all the STEM stuff that's coming home because I'm being told that's what's best for my kid. And that's really hard because you don't want to challenge what you've long believed or trusted. And so parents need tools and language and letter templates to know, wait a minute, can I ask questions? And I always want to just throw out, not to jump on teachers for this, because again, a lot of them they don't have a choice. This is what's expected. They have to use these tech platforms, but to approach it with curiosity. What is it that's, does this make sense to you? How can I support you? I'm concerned about the number of hours my kid is spending on an iPad in kindergarten, right? Like getting those curious questions out first to assess. And some schools are much better and much worse than others, right? That's the problem. It's not a one size fits all in any of this.
Stephanie, are there more questions, or do you think we can wind down?
I don't see any more in the public box. I think that's all of them.
Well, then why don't we wind down? First of all, thank you, Stephanie, for facilitating, and thank you to all our guests for joining us today, this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Really, as a committee, we are learning from all our guests. It's really wonderful. So it's a real privilege to actually be here and to learn from you things that you spent all your whole life on. So thank you for spending the time with us. To everybody else who's been involved with this public session, thank you for joining us. We hope you found it as interesting as we did as well. And we will have our next public session of the committee on Friday, starting at 1 o'clock Eastern, and everybody is welcome to join as they were today as well. To everybody, thank you. Have a good afternoon. Have a good evening. Take good care.
You too.